Hey guys, tonight we step way back in time. Picture yourself not in your cozy bed ready to drift off, but standing awkwardly in a rough-hewn room, the air thick with the smell of stale ale and nervous sweat. Your feet are sore from dancing that felt more like being shoved around. Your head is buzzing from too much wine, or maybe just sheer anxiety. You're wearing borrowed clothes that scratch, or perhaps clothes made just for today that feel utterly alien. This isn't some candlelit, rose petal strewn fantasy. This is your wedding night. And let's be honest, if you were actually there, you probably wouldn't survive the stress and the germ, let alone the night itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there blinking in the flickering light of a few strategically placed torches, or perhaps just a single rush light casting long, dancing shadows. This isn't the quiet intimacy you might imagine for such a moment. Oh no, you are not alone. Far from it. The sounds of your own wedding party, your family, your spouse's family, friends, neighbors, maybe even a few random hangers-on who just followed the promise of free food and drink, are still echoing from wherever the main revelry is happening. Some might even be crammed into this very space, watching you with expressions ranging from amused anticipation to weary indifference. It's a lot. And it's certainly not what the romantic comedies promised, is it? The stark reality hitting you tonight is that marriage in the medieval world was less about personal fulfillment and more about practical, often brutal, necessities. Forget finding your soulmate or having a meet cute in the village square. Your path to this moment, this awkward, public, slightly terrifying moment, was almost certainly laid out for you long ago by people who weren't particularly interested in your feelings. Love? That was a happy accident, a bonus if it ever showed up, and definitely not a prerequisite for tying the knot. It feels less like the culmination of a fairy tale and more like a business transaction with extremely high stakes, primarily involving the continuation of bloodlines and the accumulation or preservation of property. You shift your weight, your borrowed shoes pinching slightly. The floor beneath you might be packed earth, rough wooden planks, or maybe cold stone, depending on your social standing, which tonight feels less like a status symbol and more like a determinant of how uncomfortable you're about to be. The air smells damp, maybe a little smoky from the cooking fires that fueled the earlier feast. If it's summer, maybe a few flies are buzzing lazily. If it's winter, the chill is seeping into your bones despite the revelry. It's a far cry from climate control and fluffy duvets. Your bedchamber tonight might not even be a dedicated bedroom. It could be the main hall, a small partitioned-off corner, or even just a space cleared amongst hay bales if you're farming stock. Privacy is a concept that's about as widely understood as germ theory. Think about your own wedding night, if you've had one, or imagine what you'd want it to be. Quiet? Romantic? Just you and your new spouse? Yeah, throw all that out the window. In medieval Europe, especially among the upper classes but bleeding into peasant customs too, the consummation of a marriage was a matter of public interest. It wasn't just about the couple, it was about the families, the community, and the legal contract being cemented. The physical union wasn't a private act of intimacy, it was the legally required proof that the marriage was valid and that future heirs could be legitimate. No pressure, right? Just ignore the dozens of eyes on you. Easy peasy. This concept of public consummation, or at least publicly sanctioned transition to the marriage bed, stemmed from the deeply ingrained societal need for order and legitimacy. Land, titles, inheritance. These things weren't trifling matters. They were the bedrock of the social structure. A disputed marriage or questionable paternity could cause chaos. So the act of marriage, including its physical culmination, was often embedded within public ritual to leave no doubt. It's almost hilariously unromantic when you think about it. Imagine your parents, grandparents, and weird Uncle Bartholomew all hanging around waiting for you to... Well, you get the picture. It's less happily ever after and more awkwardly trying to pretend no one is watching. The weight of this expectation settles on you. You barely know the person standing beside you. Your spouse. Your marriage was arranged, a decision made by your parents, guardians, or even higher lords, often when you were both still children. You might have met them once or twice before this day, brief, formal encounters where you were probably too terrified or too shy to say much. You certainly haven't dated, haven't gone for walks in the park, haven't had those nervous, exciting first conversations. Your first real interaction, or at least your first interaction free from the watchful eyes of chaperones, aside from the current dozens of watchful eyes, is happening now on your wedding night. It's like a blind date where the stakes are your entire future and the entire community is watching. The social pressure is immense. For the woman, there was often the fear and the expectation of bleeding as proof of virginity in the marriage's validity. For the man, the pressure was to, well, perform. Failure to consummate could be grounds for annulment. Imagine the stress. It makes modern wedding jitters seem like a walk in the park. You aren't just marrying a person, you are marrying a family, a name, a tract of land, and the weight of feudal responsibility. Your individual desires, your hopes for this night or this marriage, are largely irrelevant compared to the bigger picture. Mainstream fact. A key element proving a marriage was valid in medieval law was often considered to be the act of consummation itself. While the vows and ceremony were important, the physical union was frequently the moment the marriage was legally and spiritually sealed in the eyes of the church and the state, especially for establishing legitimacy of potential offspring. Without it, or proof of intent to do so, a marriage could potentially be annulled. The air might be heavy with the smell of rushes strewn on the floor, a common medieval practice for covering dirt floors, absorbing spills, and providing a bit of insulation. Unfortunately, these rushes weren't changed often. They accumulated food scraps, animal droppings, and whatever else got tracked in. So, alongside the celebratory smells of roasted meat and wine, you're likely getting a whiff of stale grime. A charming backdrop for your big night. It's enough to make you nostalgic for, well, pretty much anywhere else. Maybe a nice stable. At least it has fresh hay sometimes. Quirky tidbit. Speaking of rushes, it wasn't uncommon for small animals like fleas, mice, or even sometimes larger vermin to make their homes within the floor rushes. So your medieval wedding night might involve not just uncomfortable expectations and lack of privacy, but also sharing your floor space with various tiny, scurrying or biting cohabitants. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs, or the floor mice, bite. The sounds outside the immediate bedchamber might be raucous. Medieval wedding feasts, or bridales as they were often called, giving us the word bridal, were multi-day affairs, sometimes lasting for days depending on the wealth and enthusiasm of the families involved. There would be music, often loud, sometimes discordant pipes or drums, singing, dancing, storytelling, and a whole lot of drinking. People traveled significant distances for these events, and they weren't about to let the party stop just because the main participants were being led away for the official part of the evening. You can hear laughter, shouting, maybe someone trying to sing off key. This isn't the gentle murmur of distant revelers. This is the sound of people actively participating in, or at least observing, the transition you're about to make. It's the background noise to your extreme discomfort. Imagine trying to have a serious or intimate moment while a party is raging right outside your door, maybe even in your room. It takes open concept living to a whole new, slightly terrifying level. The people watching you aren't just passive observers. Oh no, this is entertainment. A chance to see the young couple, maybe make a few jokes, offer unsolicited advice, probably crude, and generally participate in the community event. There's a sense of collective ownership over the marriage process. It reinforces social bonds and hierarchy. It also probably makes you want to crawl under a pile of those questionable rushes and disappear. You feel like an exhibit, a performance artist tasked with a very specific, non-negotiable performance, with a live peanut gallery audience. Your spouse stands beside you, perhaps equally as awkward, maybe trying to avoid eye contact with the crowd. They are a stranger, yet tonight they are the most significant person in your life. Your future, your daily life, your social standing, your potential family. It all hinges on this person and this night. It's a heavy burden for two people who likely have no emotional connection yet, or perhaps any connection at all beyond the fact that their parents signed a contract. The atmosphere, despite the crowds, might also carry an underlying solemnity. While there's revelry and crude jokes, the core act is serious business. It's about the continuity of families, the transfer of property, the making of new alliances. It's a moment sanctioned by the church and by tradition. The solemnity might manifest in the presence of a priest, a parent, or a respected elder overseeing parts of the process. They aren't there to make it romantic. They're there to make sure it's done right, by the book, and undeniably. You glance around the room, noticing the details. The simple furniture, probably heavy and made of oak. Maybe a chest where belongings are stored. A table, perhaps still littered with the remnants of earlier drinking. The walls might be stone, perhaps plastered and whitewashed, or simple wattle and daub. There are no framed pictures, no decorative trinkets, nothing that speaks of personal taste or comfort as you'd understand it. It's functional, sturdy, and likely cold. Your impending marriage bed, which is the focal point of this gathering, probably looks equally functional and not particularly inviting. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the public bedding ceremony was universally practiced across all social classes and regions of medieval Europe, or if its intensity and commonality varied significantly, being more prevalent among the aristocracy where lineage and legitimacy were paramount, and perhaps less so or absent in peasant communities, though some form of communal witnessing likely still occurred. The expectations placed upon you tonight are immense. You are expected to transition from a child, or at least an unmarried person, to a married adult, with all the responsibilities that entail. You are expected to perform a specific act that validates your marriage. You are expected to start the process of producing heirs, quickly, if possible. And you are expected to do all of this while being observed, commented upon, and potentially even assisted by your assembled community. It's a rite of passage that leaves very little room for personal feelings or comfort. It's efficient, traditional, and utterly devoid of modern romantic notions. You take a deep breath, trying to quell the butterflies in your stomach. The sounds of the party continue, a constant reminder that this isn't a dream you can wake up from. This is real. This is your medieval wedding night. And the first, most immediate reality is that you are not getting any privacy tonight. Not even a little bit. The guests are here, they are staying, and they are ready for the main event. Time to face the music and the watching eyes. So you're standing there, bathed in the awkward glow of inadequate lighting, surrounded by everyone you know and probably several people you don't, all waiting. What happens next isn't a quiet handshake and a polite farewell from the guests. Oh no. The party is simply moving venue with you two as the reluctant main act. You feel a hand on your arm, or maybe several hands. You are being led. This is the start of the bedding ceremony, the formal and often riotous process of getting the married couple into their designated bed. Imagine being a prop in your own life event. That's kind of what this feels like. A group, typically the groomsmen and bridesmaids or close family members, takes charge. For the groom, it might be his friends or male relatives who half carry, half shove him towards the chamber. For the bride, it's usually her female attendants, supporting her, guiding her. They're singing, often crude, teasing songs full of double entendre and explicit well wishes for fertility. They're shouting, laughing, maybe even some playful pushing and shoving as people try to get a better look or participate in the general chaos. The procession moves from the main hall or wherever the feasting happened towards the bedchamber. If you're lucky, this is an actual separate room. If you're less lucky, it might just be a curtained-off corner or even just the spot in the main room where a bed has been prepared. Torches might be carried to light the way, their smoky flames adding to the already thick air. The noise levels are probably still through the roof. It's less a quiet retreat and more a triumphant, slightly drunken communal escort. You are less like a couple going to bed and more like prisoners being escorted to, well, the place you're expected to perform a very specific duty. This physical act of leading the couple to the bed was symbolic, of course. It marked the transition from the public, contractual phase of the marriage to the private, physical one that would legally seal the deal. But in practice, it was intensely public. Think of it like your friends carrying you on their shoulders at a concert, but instead of rock music, it's bawdy folk songs. And instead of the stage, it's a slightly grubby mattress. And instead of cheering, it's expectant stares and potentially crude jokes shouted over the din. Good times. The journey itself might be short, just across a room, or it could involve going upstairs or down a corridor. Regardless, you are not walking alone. You are surrounded, a bubble of slightly terrified newlyweds in the middle of a boisterous crowd. You can hear comments being whispered, sometimes not so whispered. People are making bets, cracking wise, generally treating the whole affair with a mix of reverence, because it's a sacrament and legally important, and irreverence because, well, people are people, and sex is funny, apparently, especially when it's not yours. Arriving at the bedchamber, the crowd doesn't necessarily stop at the doorway. Depending on custom and social class, a significant number of guests might pile into the room with you. The space might feel small and claustrophobic, filled with too many bodies, too much noise, and too much anticipation. You finally reach the bed, which again could be anything from a lavishly draped four-poster, if you're very wealthy, to a straw-filled mattress on a simple wooden frame, or even just a pile of clean straw covered with a blanket. Clean being a relative term, of course, getting onto the bed itself is another moment of public spectacle. You aren't just quietly slipping under the covers. You are being guided, perhaps even physically lifted or pushed, onto the mattress. Your attendants might smooth the sheets, adjust pillows, or perform other small actions around the bed, all under the watchful eyes of everyone present. It's like being tucked in by your entire extended family, except the subtext is less sweet dreams and more get to it, folks, we're waiting for an heir. This part of the ceremony often involves specific rituals or superstitions. One common practice involved the guests throwing things at the couple, particularly when they were on the bed or immediately after they were in it. Grains like wheat or oats were often tossed, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. Kind of like throwing rice at modern weddings, but maybe a bit more aggressive. Shoes or stockings might also be thrown, another fertility symbol, or sometimes single stockings were thrown towards the couple, and whoever's stocking landed on the groom or bride was supposedly the next person to marry. It's like a medieval, slightly unhygienic bouquet toss. Quirky tidbit. A particularly popular game involved throwing the bride's stocking. The groomsmen would try to catch it, while the bridesmaids tried to prevent them. Whoever caught it was considered lucky and might even get to put it on the groom's leg for a moment. Meanwhile, the bride and groom were just trying to not get hit in the face with footwear while lying on the bed. Peak romance. Making noise was also crucial. The singing, shouting, and sometimes even banging of pots and pans were believed to ward off evil spirits who might try to harm the couple or prevent conception. So the atmosphere in the bedchamber was likely anything but peaceful and quiet. It was loud, boisterous, and slightly superstitious pandemonium. You're trying to process the monumental change in your life. You're next to a stranger, and there's a cacophony of well-wishers and possibly mischievous spirits right there in the room with you. The presence of witnesses wasn't just for entertainment or superstition. It served a crucial legal and social function. The community was there to witness that the couple was indeed being put into the marriage bed together, signifying their intent to consummate the marriage. This public witnessing was particularly important in times and places where written records were less common or accessible. It was an oral contract backed by communal testimony. Your neighbors and relatives weren't just being nosy, they were fulfilling a civic duty, a duty that, frankly, could have been fulfilled from outside the room. But hey, who are we to judge medieval traditions? Mainstream fact. The bedding ceremony, or cubiculum deductio, literally leading to the chamber, was a widespread ritual in medieval Europe, particularly prominent among aristocratic families, where guests would physically escort and help prepare the couple for the marriage bed, serving as witnesses to this stage of the marital process. The social dynamics were fascinating. You had everyone from potentially high-status guests to servants crammed into a relatively small space. There was a blurring of lines between celebration and solemn witnessing. While the main event was serious, ensuring the continuation of families and property lines, the lead-up was often treated as a huge, slightly chaotic party. It highlights the duality of medieval life, where deeply ingrained social structures and religious beliefs coexisted with surprisingly raucous and earthy customs. You lie there, or sit awkwardly on the edge of the bed, feeling the stares, hearing the noise, the strange mix of blessings and bawdy jokes washing over you. The smell of stale rushes, sweat, alcohol, and maybe cheap perfume or body odor fills the air. The bed itself might feel lumpy, the blankets coarse. Comfort is clearly not a priority here. The priority is getting you into that bed, witnessed by as many people as possible, to fulfill the next step of the marriage contract. Historians still argue about the exact level of privacy the couple had once they were in the bedchamber. Some sources suggest the guests might leave relatively quickly after seeing the couple settled and perhaps receiving a blessing from a priest. Others imply that guests might linger for a significant time, sometimes even staying in the room or adjacent to it for a period, perhaps until morning, to truly ensure consummation took place, or at least to witness the attempt at it. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the guests present during the bedding ritual typically left the bedchamber immediately after the couple was settled and blessed, or if they often remained in the room or nearby for a longer duration, potentially even overnight, to ensure or attest to the consummation of the marriage. Imagine the sheer pressure. You are a young person, probably barely an adult by modern standards, married to a stranger you might have met only once or twice, possibly still a bit tipsy from the feast, physically uncomfortable, surrounded by a loud crowd throwing things at you, and the entire future of two families might feel like it rests on what happens next. Your attendants might be helping you out of your elaborate, scratchy wedding clothes, another whole ordeal in itself, which we'll get to. But the immediate reality is the physical act of being put into the bed, the final step before the expectation is you get on with the reason everyone is here. You can feel the mattress beneath you, the rough texture of the sheets. The noise outside might be dying down slightly, or perhaps it's just shifted in intensity, focusing now on the activity within the room. You exchange a brief, probably terrified or resigned glance with your new spouse. They look as overwhelmed and uncomfortable as you feel. This is not the stuff of sonnets and romantic ballads. This is the messy, loud, intensely public reality of a medieval wedding night bedding. And the crowd is still here, still watching. Get comfortable? Not a chance. So you're on the bed, right? Or maybe sitting on the edge, trying to look small and less like the center of attention, which is proving difficult because, you are the center of attention. The noise is still significant, though perhaps it's shifting from a general roar to more focused murmurs and laughter from the people who are still crammed into the room with you. And now comes the next stage of this performance, getting you out of your wedding finery. Remember those layers? All that heavy fabric, the tight lacing, the pins, the various bits and bobs that make up a medieval outfit, especially a fancy one? Yeah, it's gotta come off. And guess what? You're not doing it yourself, not with this audience. Your attendants, the ones who helped you get into these clothes hours ago, are now helping you get out of them. Right here, right now, with everyone watching. Think of it like being a mannequin in a very dimly lit, very crowded department store window, while a sales assistant strips you down, except instead of potential customers, it's your relatives and friends. And instead of buying clothes, they're just watching. It's probably excruciatingly awkward. For the bride, this means patient hands working on laces that run up the back or sides of the gown. Layers are peeled away. The outer gown, maybe a kirtle or underdress beneath, possibly a chemise closest to the skin. Head coverings, veils, circlets, all carefully, or maybe not so carefully, removed. Each layer is another small reveal, another moment under the gaze of the onlookers. For the groom, it's similar, though perhaps slightly less elaborate clothing. Tunics, doublets, hose, belts all come off with the help of his groomsmen. Swords or daggers, if worn, are unbuckled and set aside. Boots or shoes are removed. It's a systematic dismantling of your public, dressed identity, happening in front of a semi-private, slightly tipsy audience. You're being reduced, layer by layer, from the formal, dressed-up person who just got married to someone much closer to, well, their bedtime state. The atmosphere during this undressing ritual could vary. Sometimes it was treated with a degree of reverence, a symbolic shedding of the old single self in preparation for the new married self. Other times, and probably more often, given the general vibe of the bedding ceremony, it was another opportunity for jokes, teasing, and ribald comments. Imagine your friends making snide remarks about your underwear or shouting unsolicited advice about what happens after the clothes are off. Hilarious. For them, maybe. For you, probably just another layer of mortification. The attendants helping you are probably trying to be efficient, but also maybe having a bit of a laugh. They know you, after all. They've probably seen you in various states of undress before, but never quite like this. With such high stakes and such a large crowd, they might whisper encouragement, or they might join in the general teasing. It's a mix of practical assistance and continued participation in the public ritual. The clothing itself was often valuable, especially the outer garments worn for the wedding feast and ceremony. These weren't just tossed aside. They would be carefully folded or hung up by the attendants, ready to be stored or perhaps reworn on special occasions. Your fancy velvet gown or embroidered tunic represented a significant investment, and even on your wedding night, property needed to be respected. You wouldn't just leave it in a heap on the floor. As the layers come off, you probably become increasingly aware of your body, of the person sitting or lying next to you, and of the intense focus of everyone else in the room. The clothes provided a kind of armor, a social barrier. Without them or with fewer layers on, you feel more exposed, more vulnerable, both literally and figuratively. It's less about comfort and more about shedding the public persona you've worn all day to prepare for the expected private act. Mainstream fact: the undressing of the bride and groom by their attendants in the presence of guests was a common component of the medieval bedding ceremony, serving as a physical and symbolic transition from their individual dressed states to a marital undressed state within the communal gaze. The level of undress reached during this part of the ceremony could also vary. You weren't necessarily stripped down to nothing in front of everyone. Often, the innermost layer, the chemise for the bride and likely a similar linen shirt for the groom, might be left on. These were considered basic undergarments, practical for sleeping and providing a minimal layer of modesty. So you're not naked, but you're certainly not dressed either. You're in your medieval equivalent of pajamas, essentially, but unlike your comfortable modern PJs, these are probably rough linen or wool, maybe a bit itchy, and you're expected to get busy in them. The guests who remain in the room are doing various things. Some might be chatting quietly among themselves. Others might still be singing or making noise to ward off evil spirits, or just because they're having fun. Some are undoubtedly watching you and your new spouse with unwavering attention. There might be more throwing of grains or stockings at this point, perhaps aimed more specifically at the bed or the couple themselves as they become less obscured by clothing. It's a spectacle, and you are the main event, transitioning before their very eyes. Imagine the smell. It's been a long, probably hot day. Feasting, maybe dancing, hours spent in heavy, layered clothing. Personal hygiene standards were, shall we say, different from today. You might have washed your hands and face earlier in the day, if you were particularly fastidious, but a full bath would have been a rare luxury for most people. Certainly not something you'd squeeze in between the ceremony and the bedding. So, as those layers come off, you're likely encountering not just the body odor of your spouse, but also the accumulated sense of the day on your own body and clothes. Add to that the smell of stale rushes on the floor, the smoke from torches or candles, the lingering aroma of the feast, and the general human smell of a room packed with people. It's probably not the most pleasant olfactory experience. Quirky tidbit: in some regions or social classes, the undressing might include a ritual where the bride's shoe was passed from the groom to the bride's male relatives. symbolizing the transfer of authority or possession before being finally removed. Imagine trying to navigate that little performance while also trying to get out of your dress and not trip. There's a definite performative aspect to all of this. You are acting out the transition into a married state for the benefit of the community. The stripping away of individual clothing symbolizes the joining of two individuals into one marital unit. The presence of witnesses validates this transition. It's less about romance and intimacy and more about social contract and public ratification. Your own feelings during this must be a roller coaster. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe a little bit of hope, a huge dose of awkwardness, and likely an overwhelming desire for everyone to just leave. You're probably trying to avoid eye contact with most people, focusing on the hands of your attendant as they work on a stubborn lace or untangle a piece of fabric. Meanwhile, your new spouse is going through the same thing right beside you, possibly looking just as uncomfortable. This whole process of public undressing feels completely alien from a modern perspective. The idea of getting ready for bed with dozens of your friends and family crammed into the room, cheering you on or just staring, is bizarre. But for medieval people, this wasn't necessarily seen as invasive in the same way. Their concept of privacy was different, often much more communal, especially in larger households or shared living spaces. Personal space was less a given right and more a luxury. Historians still argue about the precise level of intimacy that was considered acceptable for guests to witness. Did they stay until the couple was literally under the covers? Did they just see them in their shifts? Was there variation depending on social class, region, or specific family customs? Sources can be vague, often describing the process of leading to the bed and a blessing, but less explicit about the exact moment of guests' departure or how much they saw. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the public undressing ritual during the bedding ceremony concluded once the couple was in basic undergarments like shifts or shirts, or if attendants helped remove even these layers in the presence of guests before the couple was formally left, or blessed, in the bed. The clothing being removed might also hold symbolic meaning. Medieval garments were often elaborate, with complex fastenings and many layers. Getting out of them wasn't a quick task. It required help, emphasizing interdependence perhaps, or simply the practical reality of the fashion of the time. Imagine dealing with 100 tiny buttons or an intricately tied network of laces after a day of celebrating. You'd absolutely need help. It makes you appreciate zippers and elastic waistbands, doesn't it? As the final layers come off, you are likely left in just your chemise or shirt. Maybe your feet are bare now, or still in soft indoor shoes. You can feel the texture of the mattress cover through the thin fabric. The air against your skin feels different without the weight of the outer clothes. You exchange another glance with your spouse. The noise might be starting to subside slightly, or maybe you're just getting used to it. A strange kind of background hum to your intense, personal discomfort. The attendants finish folding the last garment and step back, maybe offering a final, slightly suggestive comment or a genuine well-wish. The guests who are still there are now looking at you, less like people dressed for a party and more like, well, like people about to get into bed, albeit in a very public way. The space feels even smaller now, more charged. You're no longer just dressed up participants in a ceremony. You're the two people who are expected to perform a specific function, witnessed and ratified by the community. And the next step, the final step before any semblance of privacy, if you even get any, is the religious blessing of the bed itself. But for now, you're just two slightly undressed, deeply uncomfortable people on a bed, surrounded by watchful eyes. So there you are, in your undergarments, perched or lying on the bed, feeling incredibly exposed despite the thin layer of linen. The room is still full of people, but the energy might be shifting slightly. The boisterous laughter and teasing might subside for a moment, replaced by a more focused anticipation. Because now comes the part where the serious stuff, or at least the stuff with a veneer of seriousness, happens before everyone, hopefully, goes away. This next step is the blessing of the marriage bed. This wasn't just a casual good luck from your drunk uncle. This was a formal, often religious ritual intended to sanctify the space where the marriage would, hopefully, be consummated and where children would, hopefully, be conceived. It was about inviting divine approval and protection for the physical union of the couple, which was seen as a crucial, God-ordained aspect of marriage. Usually a priest would perform this blessing if one was available and willing. If not, perhaps a respected older relative or even just a member of the wedding party might lead a prayer. The person performing the blessing would likely stand near the bed, perhaps sprinkling holy water if a priest was present. There would be prayers, invocations for fertility, harmony, and protection from evil spirits. Because, let's be honest, you wouldn't want any mischievous demons hanging around your marital bed, would you? Especially not on your first night. Imagine the chaos. Though given the crowd, you might argue they were already present in human form. During the blessing, you and your spouse would probably be expected to kneel or sit respectfully on the bed, heads bowed, trying to look devout while simultaneously wishing you were literally anywhere else. The guests around you would likely quiet down, perhaps crossing themselves or joining in the prayers if they knew them. It's a brief, relatively solemn interlude in what has otherwise been a day of revelry and awkward public performance. Mainstream fact: the formal blessing of the marital bed, often performed by a priest, was a significant ritual in medieval wedding ceremonies, intended to consecrate the physical union of the couple and pray for fertility and protection. The prayers might specifically reference biblical couples, asking that your union be as fruitful and blessed as theirs. There might be specific blessings for the bed itself, for the sheets, for the couple who would lie upon it. It's quite an intimate thing to have blessed in front of an audience, isn't it? Like having your toaster blessed at a family barbecue. Necessary, perhaps, in their eyes, but still a bit much. The purpose of the blessing wasn't just religious. It also served a practical function within the context of the bedding ceremony. It marked the formal transition from the public ritual space to the intended private space of the marital bed. It was the culmination of the communal sending off of the couple. Once the bed was blessed, the main public part of the ceremony was, in theory, complete. And that is the signal for everyone to leave, or at least the signal for most people to leave. This is the moment you have probably been waiting for all day, even more than the actual I do part, the mass exodus. The guests, having witnessed the undressing, the placement in bed, and the blessing, have fulfilled their societal duty. They have publicly ratified the marriage and its intended purpose. Their presence is no longer required, at least not in the same numbers. Getting everyone out might not be as smooth as simply pressing an eject button. Remember, these people have been drinking, feasting, and enjoying themselves all day. They might be reluctant to leave the party, even if the party has devolved into watching two people squirm on a bed. Attendants or family members might need to gently, or not so gently, usher people towards the door. There might be lingering goodbyes, final jokes, more cheering, maybe even a few stragglers trying to offer last-minute, unsolicited advice about, well, you can imagine. Quirky tidbit. In some areas, guests might throw at old shoes or other objects at the departing couple or the marital bed for good luck or fertility, adding another layer of chaotic energy to the departure process. Imagine trying to duck flying footwear while simultaneously trying to look pious during a bed blessing. Multitasking at its finest. The room, which moments before felt stiflingly full, begins to empty. The noise level drops, not to silence, but to a less overwhelming level. You can start to distinguish individual voices rather than just a general din. As people file out, you might catch snippets of conversation, see faces that smile or wink at you, or perhaps avoid your gaze entirely out of a sudden, awkward sense of propriety now that the serious part is done. The departure could have been a relatively quick process orchestrated by the hosts or attendants, or it could have been a more drawn-out affair, with guests lingering, reluctant to end the celebration. Historians still argue about how quickly and completely guests were expected to leave after the blessing. Was it immediate? Did some family members stay longer? Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the guests completely vacated the marital chamber immediately after the bed blessing, or if some close family members or designated witnesses remain for a period, perhaps even until after a symbolic consummation or the final bedding down of the couple. The traditional narrative is that the couple was left alone after the blessing. However, given the communal nature of medieval life, especially for the lower classes who might share living spaces, alone might be a relative term. Even in wealthier households, there might still be attendants sleeping nearby, or the room might not be entirely private. But the public spectacle part was definitely winding down. As the last guests, or most of the guests, leave, the atmosphere in the room transforms yet again. The intense, performative energy dissipates. It's replaced by, well, whatever was left. Awkwardness, relief, exhaustion, probably all of the above. The room might seem suddenly larger, quieter, perhaps even a little eerie after the clamor. The torches or candles might be dimmed further, casting long, flickering shadows. You're now just you and your spouse, perhaps with a very select, small group of people remaining, or perhaps truly alone for the first time all day. After hours of being the center of attention, surrounded by noise and people, the relative quiet must feel deafening. You can probably hear your own breathing, the rustling of your thin garments, the distant sounds of guests leaving the house or continuing to celebrate elsewhere. The physical discomfort is still there, the slightly rough linen shift, the unfamiliar mattress, maybe the residual itch from wearing so many layers all day. But the primary discomfort is likely social and emotional. You are now, finally, in the situation that the entire day has been building towards. And you're supposed to, what exactly? There's immense pressure. Everyone knows what's expected. The community has done its part to bring you to this point. Now it's up to you too. It's less about romantic anticipation and more about a duty, a societal expectation. And you're doing it with someone you might barely know, or at least have never been truly alone with in this capacity. It's like being dropped onto a stage with a complete stranger and being told to improvise a scene about the birds and the bees, but with the entire town having bought tickets. No pressure. The objects in the room might take on new significance in the dim light. The bed itself now blessed and central to the room. The chest where your clothes were folded. The few pieces of furniture. These mundane items are the silent witnesses to what is about to happen. The process of getting everyone to leave might involve some good-natured pushing and shoving, especially if alcohol was involved. All right, out you go. Leave them to it, you might hear, followed by laughter and protests. It's the final act of the communal escort, transitioning from escorting you to the bed to escorting themselves away from it. It's probably a relief to see them go, but also leaves you hanging in that strange space between public ritual and private reality. This moment, after the blessing and the departure of guests, is the true threshold. You are physically on the marriage bed, legally married, blessed by the church, witnessed by the community, and now, left to your own devices, or mostly so. It's the quiet before the storm, or perhaps just the quiet before the awkward silence. The feeling of exposure, even in your shift, is probably heightened now that there are fewer distractions. You can feel the air on your skin, are acutely aware of the physical presence of your spouse next to you. You might avoid looking at them directly, instead focusing on the patterns in the wood of the ceiling or the way the candlelight plays on the wall. It's important to remember that privacy as we understand it was different. Even if the guests were gone, there might be a servant sleeping in the corner or a relative just outside the door. True solitude was a luxury often reserved for the very wealthy, and even then, not necessarily expected on a wedding night. But the ceremonial witnessing was over. The community had seen you to bed. Now it was time for the marriage to be, hopefully, physically completed. The silence after hours of noise is probably the most jarring thing. It allows the weight of the situation to really settle in. You're no longer performing for a crowd. You're just two people, side by side, under immense pressure, with a very specific task ahead of you. The blessed bed awaits. What happens next is, well, that's the heart of the matter, isn't it? But for now, breathe. The crowd is gone. Mostly. The room is quieter now, much quieter. The air feels different, less chaotic, more charged, heavy maybe. The last of the wedding guests, bless their boozy hearts, have finally stumbled out, leaving you and your brand new spouse alone on the blessed bed. Or perhaps mostly alone. As mentioned before, alone in the medieval sense often still meant having an audience of some kind, be it a servant sleeping by the fire for warmth and security, or family members just outside the door, ready to provide support, witnessing. It really depended on your social standing and the customs of the specific region and time. But the main event, the big public spectacle of getting you into bed, is over. You're likely still sitting or lying there, perhaps propped up on pillows if you're lucky enough to have them. The thin linen shift feels like it's broadcasting your every movement to the empty or semi-empty room. The silence, after the raucous noise of the day, is almost deafening. You can hear the rustling of your own garments, the sound of your spouse's breathing beside you, maybe the crackling of a dying fire or the distant sounds of continued revelry from downstairs. The awkwardness hangs in the air like a thick, damp medieval fog. All day you've been performing, being looked at, being pushed and prodded through rituals. Now, the ultimate ritual awaits, and you're expected to perform without an audience, yet for the implicit approval of everyone who just left. The pressure is immense. Everyone knows what's supposed to happen. Your entire community has invested time and energy in getting you to this point. The bed has been blessed. The prayers for fertility have been said. Now it's showtime. Or rather, it's the time for the purpose of the marriage to be physically initiated. Because let's be clear, in the medieval view, the primary purpose of marriage wasn't necessarily romantic love, though that could develop. It was about procreation, about forming alliances, about transferring property, about securing the social order. And the physical act of consummation was the crucial step that made the marriage legally binding in many respects, and, more importantly, the vehicle for fulfilling the procreative purpose. Mainstream fact. While the exchange of vows created a valid marriage contract, especially after reforms in the later Middle Ages, the physical consummation of the marriage, particularly the first sexual union, was widely considered the act that made the marriage truly indissoluble and legally complete in many medieval contexts, often providing proof of the couple's ability to procreate. Without consummation, marriages could sometimes be annulled. This wasn't just a minor detail. It was the linchpin. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could potentially be challenged later. Property transfers might be questioned. Alliances might be weakened. The whole point of the wedding day, this massive expenditure of resources, time, and social energy, was to get you and your spouse to this very moment, on this very bed, to do the deed. No pressure, right? Just the future of potentially two families, possibly a village, and maybe even a noble line riding on whether you two awkward strangers managed to make it work. The expectations were particularly high for the groom. He was expected to be able to perform his marital duty. Impotence wasn't just a private medical issue. It was grounds for annulment and a significant social embarrassment. There were even specific rituals and legal processes developed around investigating claims of impotence if a marriage remained unconsummated. Imagine a panel of solemn, bearded men, and possibly midwives or older women for the bride's side, investigating whether you, dear groom, were capable. Mortifying, to say the least. It's like having to prove your ability to assemble IKEA furniture under oath, but with much higher stakes and less Swedish meatballs. For the bride, the expectation was largely one of chastity before marriage, ideally, and fertility within it. Her role in consummation was seen through the lens of procreation. While consent was, in theory, required for a valid marriage, the context of the wedding night could often be one of duty rather than desire, especially in arranged marriages, which were very common. You were there to fulfill a role, a biological and social function. The silence in the room, punctuated only by mundane sounds, makes the lack of conversation between you and your spouse feel enormous. What do you even say? So, awkward, huh? Nice weather we had earlier? Did you see Uncle Gregory fall into the punch bowl? It's hard to imagine witty repartee flowing naturally under such circumstances. You're two people, thrust together by societal expectation, lying on a bed that has just been publicly blessed, knowing exactly what you're supposed to do, with the ghostly echo of 100 well-wishers' eyes still upon you. Quirky tidbit. There are scattered historical accounts mentioning medieval witnesses to the consummation itself, ranging from close family members to legal officials, particularly in cases involving disputes over inheritance or the validity of the marriage. While perhaps not a common practice for everyone, the very existence of such customs highlights just how public and legally significant this seemingly private act could be. Imagine trying to be intimate with your parents-in-law sitting in the corner knitting. Oh, don't mind us, dear, just to making sure everything's above board. Even without official witnesses present in the room, the community had just delivered you to the bed. The assumption was that consummation would follow shortly, and there were often ways the community would try to ascertain if it had happened the next morning. Bloodied sheets were sometimes presented as proof of virginity lost and, by extension, consummation achieved, though this was not universally required or practiced and could be faked or explained in other ways. The expectation lingered. Historians still argue about the true prevalence and formality of witnesses to the act of consummation. While legal texts and some anecdotal accounts mention them, particularly for high-status or contested marriages, it's unclear how common it was for ordinary people. Was it a rare legal formality or a more widespread, though perhaps less explicit, practice? Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether formal witnessing of the actual physical consummation of a marriage was a common practice across all social strata in the Middle Ages, or if it was largely confined to aristocratic or legally disputed unions. So you lie there beside this person who is now legally bound to you. The dim light from a dwindling candle or the fireplace casts shifting shadows. You can probably feel the heat radiating from their body beside yours through the thin fabric of your shifts. The air might smell of smoke, beeswax, and maybe the lingering scent of sweat and stale wine from the day's exertions. Your mind is likely racing. What happens now? Do you talk? Do you just go for it? What if you don't know how? What if they don't know how? What if it hurts? What if it's awkward? What if nothing happens? That last one, the fear of non-consummation, would likely be paramount, particularly for the groom, but also for the bride, whose fertility was central to her value in the marriage market. The physical discomfort of the day, the tight shoes, the layers of clothing, the exhaustion, might have faded slightly compared to the overwhelming social and psychological pressure. You are on the threshold of the most intimate act possible, and it feels less like a private moment and more like the final step in a very public, very demanding job interview. And everyone you know is waiting for the results. There might have been some coaching or advice given beforehand, perhaps by older family members or friends, though accounts of what this advice entailed are scarce and likely varied greatly depending on social class and region. Was it practical information, moral instruction, just a simple good luck, don't mess it up? Probably a mix of here's vaguely what happens and don't disgrace the family name. Helpful. The bed itself, now blessed, is the focal point. It represents the physical union, the potential for new life, the continuation of the lineage. It's not just a piece of furniture, it's a stage for a vital social and biological transaction. And you are the reluctant actors. Think about the contrast with modern wedding nights, often envisioned as a private, romantic escape after the party. This is the opposite. The party ends by putting you in bed, often with others still nearby, and the expectation is immediate performance of a duty. It's less, let's start our life together privately, and more, all right, you two are coupled up, now get to work on that procreation thing. Everyone's watching or just watched. The silence stretches. Maybe one of you clears your throat. Maybe you shift positions awkwardly. The weight of expectation is almost a physical presence in the room. You're not just two individuals. You are the embodiment of a newly formed social unit, tasked with its fundamental biological purpose. It's the moment the abstract concept of marriage is supposed to become physically real. And what if it didn't happen? Medieval medical understanding was rudimentary. There were many reasons why consummation might be difficult or impossible. Physical conditions, psychological factors, lack of knowledge, incompatibility. Remember, these were often people who had little to no experience or education about sex, thrown into this situation with a stranger under immense pressure. It wasn't exactly set up for success in the romantic sense. The pressure to perform could be agonizing. For the groom, failure meant humiliation and potential annulment. For the bride, it could mean uncertainty about her future, suspicion, and potentially accusations of witchcraft or being closed, unable to be penetrated, which were serious matters. It wasn't just about personal embarrassment. It had concrete, often devastating social and legal consequences. So you lie there feeling the scratch of the linen, the coolness of the air on exposed skin, the warmth of the body next to yours. The blessed bed feels less like a haven and more like an interrogation table. The time for being paraded around is over. The time for prayer is over. The time for awkwardly pretending not to notice the crowd undressing you is over. Now comes the part everyone was really waiting for, the consummation, or the attempt at it. And the silence is amplifying the internal screams of, "What do I do now?" The candles flicker lower. The room grows darker. The sounds from outside fade. You are left with the quiet anticipation, the weight of history, biology, and societal pressure bearing down on you. The next few hours, however they play out, will be etched into the memory of your marriage and potentially into legal records if things go particularly awry. It's a moment of fraught with significance, devoid of privacy, and probably deeply uncomfortable. Sweet dreams indeed. Or perhaps just dreams of it being over. The quiet isn't empty, it's brimming with the weight of expectation. You feel it pressing down, thick and suffocating, far heavier than any of the elaborate wedding clothes you shed hours ago. All the public spectacle, the feasting, the dancing, the abduction, to the bedroom. It all funneled to this single point, this quiet or semi-quiet moment on this blessed bed. The pressure isn't just external anymore. It's burrowed deep inside. Your mind is a whirlwind of anxiety and uncertainty. You're likely exhausted, perhaps a little bit tipsy from the festivities, sore from standing and being paraded around. And now, facing something you probably have zero experience with, zero education about, zero practical advice on, beyond maybe a hushed, vague warning from an older relative that this is what husbands and wives do, or just lie still and think of England, except, think of the manor or the farm or the family name. For the groom, the pressure to perform is immense and immediate. Your ability to consummate the marriage is tied directly to your masculinity, your social standing, and the legal validity of the union. Failure is unthinkable. It's not just a personal embarrassment. It's a potential disaster that could lead to annulment, public humiliation, and questioning your fundamental capability as a man. Medieval society wasn't exactly big on performance anxiety as a valid excuse. If you couldn't, you simply couldn't, and that had serious consequences. Imagine the panic. What if I can't? What if I don't know how? What if she doesn't cooperate? What if it's awkward? Spoiler alert, it was probably epic level awkward. For the bride, the pressure is different but equally intense. Your value, in large part, is tied to your fertility and your ability to produce heirs. The consummation isn't just about bonding with your spouse, it's about opening the door to procreation. There's also the fear of pain, especially if you are a virgin, coupled with the anxiety of pleasing your new spouse and fulfilling your role. Failure on your part might not be about ability in the same way as the groom, but it could be interpreted as reluctance, being closed, a potentially serious medical or even quasi-magical issue in medieval thought, or just plain not being a good wife. Plus, there was the expectation, sometimes made public, of proving virginity was lost the next morning. More on that delightful custom later. Even if the direct crowd of onlookers has dispersed, the feeling of being watched, or at least judged, lingers. The house is full of people who were just celebrating your union and who know exactly what's supposed to happen behind this door. Family members are likely nearby. Servants might be sleeping in the same room or just outside. There's no true privacy in the modern sense. The very walls feel thin, and the air feels thick with unspoken expectations. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval accounts mention the practice of guests banging pots and pans outside the couple's room after being led to bed, a noisy charivari intended both to encourage consummation and perhaps to ward off evil spirits, or just celebrate loudly. While the intensity and duration varied by region and social class, the idea that your first intimate moments might be accompanied by a raucous soundtrack from your friends and family outside really drives home the lack of privacy. Nothing says romance like a full orchestra of amateur percussionists just beyond the door. So you lie there, or sit there, however you were left. The silence, if you're lucky enough not to have pots and pans banging, is punctuated only by the sounds of your shared breathing, maybe a distant snore from a guest who passed out downstairs, or the settling creaks of the ancient building. Every tiny movement feels amplified. Do you speak first? Do you just make a move? What constitutes making a move when you might be completely ignorant of the mechanics involved? This wasn't like a modern date where you might have had time to get to know someone, build intimacy, and maybe learn a thing or two about human anatomy, though medieval knowledge was limited there too. This was often with someone you barely knew, perhaps had only met a few times, or maybe not at all before the wedding day. You are effectively strangers, thrust into a highly charged, physically intimate situation with immense social and personal stakes. It's the ultimate icebreaker, except the ice is a mile thick and everyone's holding their breath, waiting for you to crack it. The bed itself, remember, was recently blessed, probably sprinkled with holy water, maybe even adorned with religious symbols. It's not just a piece of furniture. It's a sacred space designated for procreation within the confines of holy matrimony. This adds another layer of solemnity and pressure to an already overwhelming situation. It's not just sex, it's performing your marital duty in a blessed space for the purpose of creating legitimate offspring. The language alone makes it sound less like intimacy and more like a liturgical obligation. Medieval views on sex were complex and often contradictory. The church emphasized procreation as the primary, indeed often only, legitimate purpose of sex within marriage. Any sex not aimed at procreation, or done for mere pleasure, even within marriage, was often viewed with suspicion or outright condemnation. This moral framework added another layer of potential guilt or anxiety to the wedding night, especially for the devout. You weren't just expected to do it, you were expected to do it with the right intentions. Talk about overthinking things. Mainstream fact. For the Catholic Church and in much of medieval legal thought influenced by it, the consent to marriage vows created a valid legal contract. But the physical consummation of the marriage, intended for procreation, was considered the act that made the marriage indissoluble and fully complete in the eyes of God and canon law. Lack of consummation was a primary ground for annulment. This legal and theological weight meant that the wedding night wasn't just a personal event. It was a public-private transaction with significant consequences. Failure to consummate wasn't just a relationship issue, it was a legal challenge. Annulment was possible, but it wasn't easy or desirable. It often involved embarrassing investigations and could leave both parties in a difficult social position. The pressure to make it work, even if awkward and difficult, was immense. Historians still argue about the degree to which these strict moral and legal frameworks impacted the lived reality of married life, including the wedding night. Did ordinary couples feel this pressure constantly? Or did practicality and personal relationships, even if initially arranged, often temper the rigid doctrine? Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the strict theological emphasis on procreation as the sole legitimate purpose of sex within marriage significantly constrained marital intimacy and pleasure for the average medieval couple, or if practical realities and personal bonds often allowed for a more flexible approach in private life. The awkwardness is palpable. You might not even know how to approach each other. Are you still fully clothed under the covers, or have you managed to shed more layers? Given the public nature of being put to bed, it's likely you were stripped down to thin shifts by others, leaving you feeling exposed and vulnerable next to a near stranger who is equally exposed and vulnerable. It's a recipe for discomfort. Maybe you try to make small talk. So that was quite a feast, huh? I think I saw a whole boar go past. Yeah, loud, wasn't it, was? Or maybe the silence is too thick to break with trivialities. The task ahead looms too large. The social expectation wasn't just that you would have sex, it was often implicitly, if not explicitly, that you would be successful. And successful primarily meant getting pregnant as soon as possible. A quick conception after the wedding was a sign of fertility and a good start to the marriage. Delays could cause worry, gossip, or even lead to desperate measures like seeking out questionable cures for infertility or suspecting darker forces at work. Remember that potential crocodile dung sunscreen from way back? Yeah, people were willing to try some stuff. The pressure isn't just about the moment, it's about the future. It's about producing the next generation, continuing the family line, securing the inheritance, solidifying the alliance. This single act on this single night is the crucial first step in all of that. Imagine the fumbling, the lack of knowledge, the sheer physical awkwardness of two possibly inexperienced people trying to figure out how to be intimate under such intense scrutiny and expectation, often with very limited space and lighting. It's not exactly the stuff of romantic ballads. It's more like a very high-stakes, very uncomfortable, very public biology exam. You might be lying rigidly, trying to seem calm, while your heart hammers against your ribs. Or maybe you're mentally running through whatever vague, possibly inaccurate, advice you might have received. The air might feel cold against your skin in places, warm where your bodies touch. The scratchy wool of the blanket, if you even have one, linen sheets might be it, against your skin is a distraction, but not enough to block out the mental noise. The silence stretches, the pressure mounts. Every minute that passes without the deed being done increases the tension. Are they waiting for me? Am I supposed to initiate? What am I even supposed to do? These questions likely echoed in the minds of countless medieval newlyweds. And all the while in the back of your mind is the knowledge that people might be listening, or that they'll be asking questions tomorrow, or looking for proof. The weight of the community's eyes, even if they're closed in sleep downstairs, feels like a physical presence in the room. You are not just individuals, you are a unit that is currently failing to perform its primary function. The combination of exhaustion, ignorance, immense pressure, and lack of privacy made the medieval wedding night a far cry from a romantic idyll. It was a duty, a legal obligation, a social expectation, and often a deeply uncomfortable experience. The pressure to consummate wasn't just a suggestion, it was the bedrock upon which the legitimacy and future of the marriage rested. And you are right there feeling the full weight of it, alone or semi-alone, with a stranger on a blessed bed. The quiet is heavy, the expectation is crushing. What happens next is entirely up to two awkward, exhausted people under impossible pressure. The silence stretches, heavy and loaded. You are there in this blessed bed, next to this relative stranger, feeling the immense, crushing weight of expectation. Every part of you is screaming with the awkwardness, the pressure, the absolute unknown of what is supposed to happen now. What does happen now? This is the moment the entire elaborate, exhausting performance of the wedding day has led to, and you likely have almost no clue what the actual mechanics are. Think about it. How did people in the Middle Ages learn about sex? There were no biology classes, no candid talks with parents, especially not for girls, no internet tutorials, obviously. Knowledge, what little there was likely cobbled together from hushed conversations with peers, maybe overheated gossip, distorted whispers, perhaps some vague, possibly terrifying, warnings from older relatives. For noble children, perhaps a servant or governess offered some rudimentary, likely fear-based instruction. For peasants, observation of animals might have been the closest thing to practical example, which isn't exactly a direct translation. Information was scarce, often inaccurate, and heavily filtered through religious and social taboos. So here you are, potentially completely ignorant, standing or lying or sitting rigidly on the precipice of what is considered the central act of marriage, the act that validates the whole thing, and you might not even know the basic anatomy involved, let alone the practical steps. It's like being told you have to build a complex machine to save the world, but you've never seen a tool or a blueprint, and everyone is just staring, waiting for you to start. The setting doesn't exactly lend itself to easing into things. The bed, though possibly large and stuffed with straw, feathers, or even down for the wealthy, might still be cold. The room could be drafty. Lighting would be minimal, maybe a single sputtering candle left nearby, or perhaps just the dim glow from the hearth in another room, casting long, dancing shadows that only heighten the sense of unease. Privacy, as we discussed, is a relative concept. Even if the Caravari has stopped, the house is full. You can practically feel the collective anticipation from downstairs. The goal of this moment, in the eyes of medieval society and the church, is singularly focused: procreation. This isn't about romance or pleasure. In fact, pleasure was often viewed with suspicion, or intimacy built over time. It's about the duty to produce legitimate heirs. This focus dictates the approach, or lack thereof, to the sexual act itself. There isn't likely to be much in the way of foreplay or gentle exploration. The objective is direct and functional. For the groom, the task is clear and the pressure immense. He has to perform, not just physically, but effectively, in a way that achieves the desired outcome. Any difficulty or perceived inadequacy would be a profound blow to his status and masculinity. Imagine the terror of not knowing what you're doing, combined with the absolute necessity of succeeding, and the knowledge that failure has legal and social consequences. He might be fumbling awkwardly, trying to recall whatever vague hints he's picked up, perhaps nervous and unable to. Well, you get the idea. Performance anxiety isn't a modern invention, even if the language to describe it wasn't the same. For the bride, the experience is likely layered with apprehension, fear of pain, and the anxiety of submission. Medieval medical understanding of female anatomy and sexuality was limited and often inaccurate. Pain on the wedding night, particularly if the bride was a virgin, was expected and often seen as proof of virtue in the successful completion of the act. There would be no attempt to ease discomfort or prioritize her experience beyond the basic requirement for consummation. Her role was primarily passive and receptive. This isn't the stuff of knights and damsels in shining armor. This is potentially clumsy, uncomfortable, perhaps painful, and utterly devoid of the romantic notions we associate with a wedding night today. It's a biological function performed under duress, with limited knowledge and maximum pressure. It's about getting the job done, not creating a cherished memory. Mainstream effect. Medieval medical treatises, often based on ancient Greek and Roman texts like those of Galen, generally understood the female body as a cooler, less perfect version of the male body. They believed that both men and women produced seed necessary for conception, but the understanding of the female reproductive process, including ovulation and the role of the ovaries, was rudimentary and often tied up with humoral theory, the balance of bodily fluids. So picture it: two people, perhaps barely acquainted, lying side by side in a dimly lit, possibly cold room under heavy blankets. One, likely the groom, trying to initiate something he barely understands, driven by immense social pressure and duty. The other, likely the bride, apprehensive, perhaps scared, certainly ignorant, steeling herself for discomfort or pain, also driven by duty and the expectation of submission. The actual physical encounter would likely be brief, awkward, and focused solely on the act necessary for conception. There would be little, if any, consideration for mutual pleasure. In fact, dwelling on pleasure could be considered sinful. Let's try a joke to lighten the mood, shall we? What did the medieval groom say to the bride? "Fancy meeting you here, and also apparently doing this." Okay, perhaps not hilarious, but you get the vibe. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The potential for difficulties was high. What if the groom was unable to perform due to nerves, inexperience, or simply lack of attraction to his new spouse? Remember, these were often arranged marriages. What if the bride resisted out of fear or reluctance? While outright refusal was rare due to the social consequences, passive resistance or extreme fear could certainly complicate things. The pressure cooker environment wasn't exactly conducive to overcoming physical or emotional barriers. Quirky tidbit: Some medieval folk beliefs suggested various charms or rituals to ensure potency for the groom or fertility for the bride on the wedding night. These could range from carrying certain herbs or stones to more elaborate, sometimes superstitious, practices meant to ward off impotence caused by witchcraft or the evil eye. Because, of course, if things didn't go according to plan, it must be magic, right? Or maybe just crippling anxiety. Who can say? The lack of privacy extended even into the potential aftermath. In some social strata and regions, there was a custom, often called the showing of the sheets, or similar, where evidence of consummation, specifically the breaking of the hymen, was expected to be displayed the next morning. A sheet stained with blood served as public proof that the marriage had been physically completed and the bride was a virgin upon marriage. This horrifying practice added yet another layer of pressure to the wedding night. Not only did you have to perform, but the result had to be physically observable and verifiable by others. Can you imagine anything less romantic or more humiliating? It's the medieval version of a performance review, except your entire family is there to give notes. Historians still argue about how widespread the practice of showing the sheets actually was across different regions and social classes. Was it a common expectation or a more localized custom, perhaps exaggerated in later accounts? Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the public display of blood-stained sheets as proof of consummation and virginity was a universally practiced or merely regional and occasional custom across medieval Europe. Beyond the act itself, the psychological toll would be significant. You've just navigated a whirlwind of public ceremony, feasting, and physical exertion. Being paraded, potentially abducted. You're likely exhausted, possibly overwhelmed, and now faced with this intensely private, yet paradoxically public expectation. The awkwardness of trying to navigate intimacy with a near stranger, combined with the fear of failure and the weight of societal judgment, would be immense. Another little joke? What do you call a nervous medieval groom? A consummate mess. Okay, I'll stick to the history. The bed might have felt less like a haven and more like a stage. Every rustle of the bedding, every hesitant movement would feel amplified. The silence, if there was any respite from the caravari, would be deafening. You might lie there, both of you, for a long time, gathering courage, or simply frozen by the enormity of the moment and the lack of knowing how to begin. The knowledge that failure was not just a personal disappointment, but a potential legal issue added a chilling layer of pressure. If consummation didn't happen for a significant period after the wedding, it could be grounds for an annulment, essentially dissolving the marriage as if it never happened. This was a complex legal process, often requiring physical examinations and witness testimony, which would be incredibly humiliating for both parties. The desire, or perhaps the desperate need, to avoid this public and legal entanglement would be a powerful motivator, so the fumbling attempt would likely occur. Driven by duty, legal necessity, and societal pressure, not by passion or desire. It would be a functional act aimed at a specific biological outcome, carried out by two people potentially ill-equipped with knowledge or experience, under the weight of intense scrutiny, both real and perceived. The pain is for the bride, the anxiety for the groom, the sheer awkwardness of the situation. This was the likely reality for many medieval couples on their wedding night. It was a task to be completed, a hurdle to be cleared, the essential first step in fulfilling the purpose of their union, not a culmination of romantic love. And the sheer unadulterated awkwardness of it all is almost painful to contemplate, even centuries later. You're there in that moment, feeling the scratch of the rough sheets, the cold in the air, the pounding of your own heart, and the crushing weight of expectation bearing down on you. What happens next? You have to make a move. The silence of the night, if it ever truly settled, eventually gives way to the rustle and stirrings of the morning. The candle light flickers out, or the gray light begins to creep through whatever small, unglazed window openings exist. You wake up, still tangled in coarse blankets, probably still feeling the lingering awkwardness and pressure from the previous hours. Maybe a little sore, certainly tired. The air might be cold. The straw in the mattress probably feels lumpy. And the first thought, the immediate heavy realization that crashes down on you, is that this isn't over. Not yet. The wedding night was just one intensely focused hurdle. The morning after, that's where the verification happens. Remember how everyone was watching and waiting? Well, they're still watching and waiting, just in a different way. The privacy you briefly maybe had is about to be thoroughly invaded again. In many areas, and particularly among the noble classes, there was a custom where witnesses, often members of the wedding party, family members, or even designated officials, would essentially check on the couple the morning after. This wasn't a polite knock on the door with a tray of pastries, though a breakfast might follow. This was a practical, legal, and social inspection. They would enter the room sometimes quite early to see the couple, to observe their demeanor, and in some cases to look for physical evidence of consummation. Yes, we're talking about the infamous showing of the sheets. This is where the potentially blood-stained sheet from the bed might be presented as proof that the marriage had been physically consummated and that the bride was a virgin entering the marriage. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated humiliation of this. You've just navigated the most intimate and awkward experience of your life, likely with little knowledge or comfort, under immense pressure, and now the evidence is potentially going to be put on display for inspection by others. It's like having your performance review broadcast on the local news. The witnesses weren't just being nosy, though that was probably part of it. They were performing a crucial social and legal function. Consummation was the act that, alongside the vows, truly cemented the marriage in the eyes of the church and the law. It validated the union and, crucially, made any future children legitimate heirs. Without consummation, a marriage could potentially be annulled. So, verifying the act was vital for establishing the legality and permanence of the union. The sheet was, in a grim way, your certificate of authenticity. The scene would be incredibly awkward. You're in bed, possibly disheveled, maybe still half asleep from exhaustion. The door opens, and in come these witnesses. They might politely avert their eyes, or they might be quite direct in their purpose. They'd look at the bed, perhaps ask a question or two, though what do you even say in that situation? So, how was your night? Oh, standard post-nuptial physical examination. And then if the custom was followed strictly, the sheet would be examined. For the bride, if the sheet was stained, it was proof of her virginity upon marriage in the successful completion of the act. This was considered honorable and cemented her place in the marriage. For the groom, a stained sheet was proof of his potency and ability to perform his marital duty, also upholding his honor and status. It was a moment of collective relief for the families involved. The marriage was valid, the lineage secure, the potential for future legal disputes minimized. Cue the slightly less anxious nodding and murmurs of approval. Now let's inject a little humor into this deeply uncomfortable scenario. What's a medieval couple's favorite morning drink after the wedding night? Consummate tea. Okay, I'll see myself out. But what if the sheet wasn't stained? Or what if, for whatever reason, the witnesses were not convinced that consummation had occurred? This could lead to serious complications. Doubts could be raised about the validity of the marriage. Whispers might start about the groom's inability to perform, leading to potential humiliation and damage to his reputation, or the bride's lack of readiness or cooperation, which could be interpreted in various, often negative ways. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, specific rituals were performed the morning after, beyond just inspecting the sheets. These might include sharing a special meal, receiving symbolic gifts from the witnesses, or even the groom formally presenting a morning gift, Morgengaben, to the bride, which was often property or valuables, acknowledging the dowry had been activated, so to speak, and providing her with some financial security independent of her husband. It was a bit like, okay, you survived the night, here's some land. If consummation was clearly not achieved, the path forward became difficult. The couple might be given more time, perhaps a few more nights, under continued scrutiny. If it still didn't happen, or if one party refused, it could lead to an annulment process based on non-consummation. This was a lengthy and public ordeal, often involving detailed testimonies, sometimes physical examinations, yes, really, by midwives or other appointed women for the bride, and legal proceedings in ecclesiastical courts. It was the last thing anyone wanted. The pressure to just make it happen on the wedding night was partly driven by the desire to avoid this potential future nightmare. Mainstream fact. Under medieval canon law, a marriage could be annulled if it was proven that it had never been consummated. This wasn't a divorce, which was extremely rare and difficult to obtain. An annulment declared that the marriage had never been valid from the beginning, often allowing both parties to remarry. However, proving non-consummation could be incredibly challenging and humiliating. So the morning after wasn't usually a leisurely, romantic start to married life. It was often another layer of social expectation and verification piled on top of the stress of the night before. You've likely had little sleep, you're surrounded by people who were just watching you get married yesterday and might now be implicitly checking if you did the deed correctly, and you're supposed to somehow transition into being a functional married couple. What happens after the witnesses leave, assuming they do? The wedding festivities weren't always immediately over. Depending on the wealth and status of the families, the feasting and celebrations might continue for several more days. You might still be expected to appear with your new spouse, greet guests, participate in activities, all while dealing with the mental and physical exhaustion of the past 24-48 hours and the lingering awkwardness between you and your new husband or wife. Imagine trying to make polite conversation with distant relatives while still feeling deeply uncomfortable about the incredibly private thing you just or didn't just do together, which they might have just verified. It's the definition of socially awkward. The transition from the wedding bubble back to reality was often abrupt. After the last guest departed or the official period of celebration ended, you were suddenly just married, and life had to continue. The rhythm of the household, the demands of your station, the expectations placed upon a husband and wife, these would immediately come crashing in. For the bride, this often meant navigating a new household. If she moved to her husband's family home, which was common, especially for women marrying into families of higher status or wealth, she would suddenly be living under the roof and authority of her in-laws, particularly her mother-in-law. This transition could be incredibly difficult, marked by unfamiliar customs, a new hierarchy, and the challenge of finding her place within an established family structure. She might go from being a protected daughter in her birth home to a subordinate member of her husband's household, expected to learn new duties and navigate complex family dynamics. For the groom, life might change less dramatically in terms of location, but the weight of responsibility would increase significantly. He was now the head of his own or future household, responsible for his wife, potentially for managing the dowry she brought, and for ensuring the continuation of his family line. The expectations on him as a provider and patriarch would immediately take effect. The first day, beyond the morning checks, might involve performing small symbolic acts together as a couple, solidifying your new status. Or it might simply be a plunge back into the mundane. For the peasant couple, it might mean getting up early to work in the fields, side by side just like any other day, but now with the added layer of being husband and wife. For a noble couple, it might involve managing household staff, discussing estate matters, or preparing for visits. There's a scholarly debate here that's quite interesting. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval marriage rituals, including the wedding night and morning after customs, reflected actual lived experiences versus idealized or formal prescriptions. Were these practices strictly followed by everyone, or were they more flexible in reality, varying greatly by region, social class, and individual circumstances? It's likely the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The expectation was there, but the reality probably had a lot more messy variation than the formal records suggest. Another attempt at humor. Why did the medieval newlywed couple bring a ladder to the bedroom? Because they heard marriage was the next step. Right, okay, focusing back on the history. The psychological shift from single person preparing for marriage to married person with immediate duties and expectations would be profound. You are no longer just you. You are part of a unit, bound together legally, socially, and economically. This new identity is thrust upon you almost overnight. The intimacy, or lack thereof, of the wedding night, the scrutiny of the morning after, the return to the rhythm of life, it all hits you at once. You might spend that first day feeling incredibly self-conscious around your new spouse, unsure how to interact now that you share a bed and a legal bond. The formal, public nature of the wedding might make the transition to private, daily interaction feel even more awkward. What do you talk about? How do you share a meal? How do you navigate the mundane tasks of life with this person who was, until yesterday, a relative stranger with whom you just went through an incredibly stressful ordeal? The day might feel like a blur of activity, perhaps still recovering from the feasting and lack of sleep, while simultaneously trying to process the seismic shift in your life. The expectations are clear. You are now married, and your life's purpose, in many ways, is now intertwined with that of your spouse and the continuation of your respective families. The morning after the medieval wedding wasn't just about waking up. It was about facing the reality of a lifelong commitment, verified and scrutinized, and immediately stepping into the roles that society had defined for you two. It's less happily ever after and more, okay, time to get to work. And the work started immediately. The flurry of the wedding, the tension of the night, the awkwardness of the morning after inspection, it all fades, not slowly, but with surprising speed. One moment you're the center of attention, navigating ancient customs and immense pressure. The next, you're just married. The guests depart. The last scraps of the feast are cleared away or eaten by the dogs and the ever-present pigs roaming the village. And the heightened reality of the past few days collapses back into the everyday. There's no honeymoon, no gentle decompression period. The transition from betrothed or newlywed to just plain married is remarkably swift and, for many, quite jarring. You are now part of a unit, officially, legally, and socially. Everything you do, everything you are, is now linked to this other person. And that other person, remember, is likely still a near stranger. Sharing a bed, sharing a name, if the bride took her husband's, which wasn't always the case but often happened in practice, especially for identity purposes. Sharing a household, it's a radical immediate shift. You have to figure out how to exist together, not just for one night of ritual intimacy, but every single day, from the first crack of dawn until you extinguish the final rushlight or banked fire ember at night. For the bride, the immediate reality is often a physical displacement. You've moved. You are no longer in the home where you grew up, surrounded by the familiar sounds, smells, and rhythms of your birth family. You are now in your husband's world. This might mean moving into his family home, which could range from a small, single-room dwelling shared with parents, siblings, and even livestock, to a large, bustling manor house with numerous servants and retainers. Regardless of size or status, it is not your original home. Imagine trying to navigate a new kitchen when you don't know where anything is, or understanding a household's specific rules and unspoken customs when you're used to a different way of doing things. It's like starting a new home and moving into a shared apartment with strangers all on the same day, but with the added layer of being legally bound to one of the strangers. The dynamic with your in-laws is suddenly paramount. The mother-in-law relationship is historically depicted as complex, and in the medieval context, it often was. The bride was entering the mother-in-law's domain. This woman had previously been the primary female authority figure in the household, often managing the domestic sphere, overseeing servants, if any, and raising her son. You are, in a sense, a newcomer who has taken her son's primary attention and will eventually be responsible for producing heirs. This could be a source of significant friction, especially if the mother-in-law felt her authority was being challenged, or if she simply didn't like her new daughter-in-law. You might find yourself suddenly answerable to your mother-in-law in many aspects of daily life, from how you manage your time and tasks to how you dress and behave. Her word could carry significant weight, potentially even more than your husband's, especially in the initial period as you were establishing yourself. It required tact, patience, and often a willingness to adapt to established ways of doing things, even if they felt foreign or less efficient than what you were used to. It wasn't always easy to find your footing and assert your own place within the household hierarchy. Quirky tidbit. In some legal traditions, a woman's dower rights, her claim to a portion of her husband's property if she became a widow, were partly contingent on her having lived in his house and borne him children. Living under the in-laws' roof wasn't just a social custom. It could have long-term financial implications for the bride's security. It was literally part of securing your future by enduring the present. For the groom, the change, while perhaps less physically disruptive if he remained in his family home, came with a different kind of weight. He was now a husband, responsible not only for himself but for his wife's welfare and status. The expectations on him to provide, to manage his household, and to participate in community life as a married man intensified. He had to navigate the relationship between his wife and his mother, often acting as a mediator or finding himself caught in the middle. It was a step up in status, but also a significant increase in responsibility. You both have to figure out the rhythm of your shared life. What time do you wake up? Who fetches the water or starts the fire? Who prepares the meals? Who manages the finances, however meager? What are your shared duties? What are your individual tasks? For peasant couples, this might mean coordinating labor in the fields, sharing the burden of household chores, and working together to ensure survival. For wealthier couples, it might involve dividing responsibilities for estate management, overseeing different parts of the household, and managing social obligations. And you're doing all of this while still getting to know each other. The wedding night was one experience, the mundane reality of sharing cramped living space, eating together every day, dealing with illness, tiredness, bad moods, and the sheer ordinariness of life is another entirely. There's no script for this part. You have to learn each other's habits, pet peeves, strengths, and weaknesses through daily interaction. It's a prolonged, low stakes, compared to the wedding night anyway, awkward first date that lasts for the rest of your lives. How do you handle disagreements? How do you express affection, if any exists yet, beyond formal duty? How do you build companionship? These are questions you likely hadn't had the luxury of considering amidst the wedding preparations and pressures. Now suddenly, they are your daily reality. You are forced into proximity and expected to function as a harmonious unit, even if the foundations of that harmony are currently just necessity and legal obligation. Mainstream fact. While modern conceptions of marriage often emphasize romantic love, medieval marriage was primarily an economic and social contract. It was about forging alliances between families, consolidating property, producing legitimate heirs, and creating a functional unit for survival and prosperity. Love might develop over time, but it was rarely the primary reason for the union, especially among the elites. Think about sharing a bed every night. Medieval beds weren't always the picture of comfort. They might be straw mattresses on a simple frame or piles of straw on the floor. They were often shared not just by the couple, but sometimes by children, servants, or even guests, depending on the size of the dwelling and social custom. Privacy, as we understand it, was a luxury few possessed. Learning to sleep beside someone, adjusting to their movements, their snoring, their body heat, or lack thereof, was part of the adjustment. And if you were in a shared room, doing so discreetly added another layer of complexity. Why did the medieval couple get a dog? Because they heard it was man's best friend, and they were still figuring out who their own best friend was. It's a slow burn, this marriage thing. Daily routines would have been dictated by the seasons, the demands of work, and the liturgical calendar. You'd rise before dawn, often by necessity, due to lack of light or the need to tend to chores or fields. Meals would be simple and often eaten together, but perhaps without much conversation, focusing instead on the task of sustenance. Work would consume most of the day. Leisure time was limited and often communal, tied to religious festivals or local events. You weren't just a couple, you were also members of a community, and your place within that community was now redefined by your marital status. Historians still argue about the degree of agency individuals had within these arranged or socially dictated marriages. Were couples simply passive players in a larger economic and social game? Or did they find ways to build personal relationships, exert influence within their household, and shape their own marital experience despite the constraints? It's likely a mix. The formal structure was rigid, but human nature finds ways to adapt, connect, and navigate even the most challenging circumstances. Let's try another joke. What's a medieval knight's favorite part of married life? The jousting tournaments. Because at least there, the rules were clear and you knew who your opponent was. The expectations on both spouses were clear, though often unequal. The wife was typically responsible for managing the household, raising children, preparing food, making clothing, and often assisting in manual labor, especially in peasant families. The husband was the primary provider, responsible for farming, trade, craft, or military service, and was the legal head of the household. While there was often collaboration and partnership, particularly in working-class families where survival depended on it, the hierarchical structure was deeply ingrained. Establishing a working relationship based on mutual respect, cooperation, and perhaps eventually affection was the task that lay ahead. It wasn't the dramatic, often overwhelming process of the wedding itself, but a slow, grinding, day-by-day effort. Learning to communicate, sharing responsibilities, supporting each other through the inevitable difficulties of medieval life, illness, famine, conflict, loss. These were the things that would determine the success and character of your marriage over the long term. Imagine trying to discuss something important, like a leaky roof or a sick pig, with someone you barely know, whose family is hovering nearby, judging your every interaction. It required a level of practical focus that probably left little room for dwelling on the awkwardness of your shared sleeping quarters or the embarrassment of the sheet showing. Life, with its endless demands, quickly overtook the initial discomfort. The shared rhythm you had to find wasn't just about coordinating chores. It was about developing a shared identity. You were no longer just son of father's name or daughter of father's name. You were now the husband's last name, or the couple from the cottage down the lane. Your individual reputations became intertwined. Your successes and failures reflected on each other and on your respective families. This public dimension added another layer to the private challenge of building a life together. Let's lighten the mood one more time. Why did the medieval couple bring a map to bed? Because they were trying to find their way to happily ever after. Spoiler, it's not a destination, it's a journey, often involving a lot of mud and questionable sanitation. The days would blur into weeks and weeks into months. The initial novelty and awkwardness of sharing a life with a relative stranger would slowly give way to routine, familiarity, and perhaps, if you were fortunate, a grudging respect or even genuine affection. Children would likely follow, adding new dynamics and responsibilities to the mix. The shared experiences, both positive and negative, would gradually weave you together. This phase, the settling in, the finding of a shared rhythm amidst the demands of daily medieval life and the complexities of navigating new family structures, was arguably more crucial to the long-term survival and functioning of the marriage than the dramatic wedding night itself. It was the silent, ongoing process of becoming a couple, not in the eyes of the law or the church, but in the quiet reality of sharing a fire, a meal, and the weight of existence, day after day, year after year. The wedding was the contract. The daily life was the labor of fulfilling it. So you're settling in, you're finding your feet, or perhaps just trying not to trip over the unfamiliar thresholds. You're figuring out the delicate dance with your in-laws, navigating the quiet necessity of coexisting with this person you're now tethered to. The dramatic peak of the wedding and its immediate aftermath has passed. You might think, okay, deep breath, we survived, now for life, and yes, it is life. But medieval life, especially for a newly married couple, quickly introduces its next major pressure point, a pressure that dwarfs even the awkwardness of the wedding sheets, the expectation of children, specifically the expectation of heirs. This wasn't a gentle hope for future pattering feet. This was a societal imperative, a family demand, and often a perceived religious duty. For most couples, especially those with any kind of property or status to pass on, getting pregnant wasn't just a desired outcome of marriage. It was arguably the primary purpose. You didn't just get married to find companionship or share your life. You got married to continue the lineage, secure inheritance, and provide for your old age, because medieval retirement plans were basically, have children who will look after you. The clock starts ticking almost immediately. Remember that morning after inspection? Part of that was assessing virginity, yes, but it also implicitly set the stage. Now that consummation had happened, the next step, the expected step, was conception. And ideally, conception followed by a healthy pregnancy and birth, producing, well, ideally, a son. For families who owned land, a craft, a business, or held a noble title, a male heir was crucial for continuity. A daughter might be valuable for making alliances through marriage, but a son carried the name and the legacy directly forward. The pressure falls disproportionately on the wife. You might feel eyes on you, waiting for signs, waiting for news. Your body becomes a subject of intense interest and scrutiny, not just from your husband, but from his family, especially his mother, and potentially the wider community. Are you eating enough? Are you eating too much? Are you carrying water? Are you sitting correctly? Every little thing you do, every slight change in your physical state, might be interpreted as a sign. It must have felt like living under a microscope, but instead of looking for bacteria, people were looking for babies. Imagine the stress. You've just moved into a new household, are figuring out a relationship with a relative stranger, and now you also have the immense burden of proving your fertility and capability to produce heirs hanging over your head. It's like getting married and then immediately being told your performance review for the rest of your life starts now, and the only metric is, does she produce offspring? And if you don't get pregnant quickly, or if you miscarry, or if you only have daughters, the whispers would start. Was she barren? Was it her fault? Was she cursed? The blame often, though not exclusively, landed on the woman. This pressure wasn't just social. It could have real-world consequences. In some cases, if a marriage remained childless for a significant period, it could be grounds for annulment, particularly among the elite, though proving it was impossible to have children was difficult. Your social standing, your husband's standing, and the future of both your family's assets and names could hinge on your ability to conceive and carry a child to term. No pressure, right? Just the entire future of your family line resting on your reproductive organs, about which you probably had zero actual scientific understanding. And speaking of understanding, this is where things get particularly tricky, and from a modern perspective, perhaps a little baffling. While people in the Middle Ages understood that sexual intercourse was necessary for conception, usually, their grasp of the biological process was, shall we say, hazy at best. There wasn't a concept of eggs and sperm interacting in the way we understand it today. Medieval theories on conception were a fascinating mix of ancient and Greek ideas, particularly those of Aristotle and Galen, folk belief, and theological interpretations. One prevalent idea, stemming from Aristotle, was that the man provided the seed or the form, while the woman provided the matter or the substance from which the child was shaped. Think of the man as the architect and the woman as the clay. Both were necessary, but the active principle was often seen as residing in the male. This reinforced the idea that the man was the primary force in procreation, even while the pressure to produce rested on the woman's body. Other theories involved the idea of two seeds, one from each parent, which needed to mix and be cooked in the womb. The quality, quantity, and timing of these seeds, influenced by things like the parent's health, diet, emotional state, and even astrological conditions, were all thought to play a role. It was believed that conception was more likely if both partners experienced pleasure, as this was thought to release their respective seeds effectively. This meant there was a theoretical link between marital intimacy and successful procreation, although the focus remained firmly on the result rather than the experience itself. Because the actual mechanism was a mystery, people looked for explanations and interventions wherever they could. If you weren't getting pregnant, it wasn't simply a matter of biological incompatibility, a concept they didn't really have. It might be seen as divine displeasure, witchcraft, a physical blockage, or an imbalance of humors. This led to a wide array of remedies and practices aimed at promoting fertility. Quirky tidbit. Folk remedies for infertility were incredibly varied and sometimes creative. They might involve drinking concoctions made from herbs, some genuinely medicinal, others not, animal parts like hare's uterus, thought to be fertile, or even graveyard dirt, wearing amulets, visiting specific shrines or holy wells associated with fertility, performing certain rituals under particular moon phases, or using charms inscribed with magical words were also common practices. Imagine being desperate for a child and being told to wear a pouch of badger testicles around your neck. Desperate times indeed. For the husband, while the public pressure to get pregnant fell less directly on him, his virility was still crucial. Infertility could also be blamed on the man, though perhaps less frequently in common discourse. A man who couldn't produce children might have his masculinity questioned, and his family would be equally invested in his ability to father heirs. If the wife wasn't getting pregnant, his potency might be scrutinized, leading him to try some of the same remedies, often aimed at increasing his seed or vigor. It was a joint enterprise in theory, but the societal gaze often fixated on the wife's womb. Imagine the conversations, or perhaps the awkward silence, between you and your new spouse if months went by without a pregnancy. Are you having sex correctly? Is one of you cold or dry according to humoral theory? Are you doing something to offend God? Are you the victim of an evil spell? Without medical understanding, every delay, every failed attempt could fuel anxiety and potentially cause friction in the relationship. You're trying to build a life together, figure out how to share a room, and simultaneously perform this vital biological function on demand, under scrutiny, with no clear instructions and lots of potentially weird advice. Why did the medieval doctor always carry a small bag of flour? Because he believed the key to conception was having a good batch. Okay, maybe not a good joke, but humoral theory was pretty close to this mixing idea. The church's view on marriage further emphasized procreation. While it also recognized marriage as a remedy for sin and a means of mutual support, the generation of children was considered one of its primary goods. Sometimes the primary good. To deliberately prevent conception was generally seen as sinful, though methods of doing so were poorly understood and rarely discussed openly in theological terms. Beyond condemnations of practices seen as unnatural or stemming from lust rather than procreative intent, the rhythm method existed in theory, based on ancient ideas about fertile times, but it was unreliable and not widely promoted as a licit form of family planning, which wasn't really a concept anyway. The expectation was generally, be fruitful and multiply. This constant underlying pressure shaped marital life significantly. Sex wasn't just about intimacy, though affection could certainly develop and be expressed through it. It was often viewed primarily through the lens of procreation. Marital duties included the expectation of engaging in intercourse with the goal of having children. Refusal could, in some circumstances, be grounds for complaint to church authorities, though this was rare in practice for common folk. The sexual relationship was, right from the start, inextricably linked to this immense societal and familial expectation of fertility. Mainstream fact. Among the nobility and royalty, the pressure to produce an heir was particularly intense and politically significant. Dynasties depended on it. Failure to produce a male heir could lead to succession crises, civil war, or the extinction of a noble line. Royal couples were under immense public and private pressure, often resorting to desperate measures, including questionable medical advice and lavish prayers or pilgrimages to ensure the birth of a son. Their bodies, and especially the queen's, were seen almost as public property, vessels for the future of the kingdom. The vulnerability associated with infertility must have been profound. Imagine being a woman unable to conceive in a society where your worth was so heavily tied to your ability to bear children. It wasn't just personal disappointment. It could mean social marginalization, pity, or scorn, and a sense of failing your husband, his family, and your own. Similarly, a man deemed infertile faced significant challenges to his reputation and status. It was a shared burden, but the visible lack of a pregnancy kept the spotlight firmly on the woman. Historians still argue about the emotional impact of infertility in the Middle Ages. While the economic and social pressures are well documented, how did couples feel about their inability to conceive? Was there deep personal sorrow and frustration, or was it primarily viewed through the lens of religious or societal failure? It's hard to know, as personal feelings are less often recorded than legal or religious concerns, but it's reasonable to assume that for many, the desire for children and the grief of not having them would have been deeply felt on a personal level too. Let's try another joke. Why did the medieval farmer make sure his wife had a lot of fertilizer? because he heard it was good for family growth. All right. Staying PG-13 is a challenge sometimes. Prayers and religious devotion were a major part of coping with the anxiety of conception. Couples would pray for fertility, make vows, or go on pilgrimages to sites associated with saints known for aiding conception or childbirth. There were specific prayers and rituals recommended by the church or found in popular devotional texts aimed at helping women conceive and have safe pregnancies. This blend of folk practice, medical theory, such as it was, and religious faith characterized the approach to procreation. You tried the herbs, you wore the amulet, you prayed to the Virgin Mary, and you hoped for the best. The timing of intercourse was also sometimes considered important, though the rules were often more about avoiding certain times than identifying fertile ones. The church placed restrictions on sexual activity during specific periods, Lent, Advent, before receiving communion, on certain feast days, Sundays and fast days. This meant that even the act of trying to conceive was regulated by the liturgical calendar, adding another layer of external constraint to the couple's private life. Imagine trying to plan when to have sex based on the fasting schedule and the phase of the moon, hoping it aligns with whatever opaque biological process might be happening. The anxiety around conception wasn't just about getting pregnant. It was also about the dangers of childbirth itself. Childbirth was incredibly perilous for both mother and child in the Middle Ages. High infant mortality rates were a fact of life, and maternal mortality during or shortly after birth was tragically common. So the pressure wasn't just to conceive, but to successfully bring a child into the world and see them survive infancy. Every pregnancy, every birth was a risky undertaking, a gamble with high stakes. You weren't just trying to start a family, you were facing potentially life-threatening challenges with each attempt. The expectation of procreation, therefore, permeated every aspect of a newly married couple's life. It influenced their private intimacy, their public reputation, their relationship with their families, and their spiritual practices. It was a constant, low-level hum of expectation that could, if unfulfilled, escalate into significant stress and even crisis. You might be sharing a bed, a meal, and a life, but you were also sharing the weighty responsibility of continuing the lineage, facing the mysteries of biology, and praying for divine favor, all while trying to figure out how to actually live together. It was a complex, demanding, and often anxiety-ridden start to the long journey of medieval marriage. So you've navigated the murky waters of medieval wedding nights and the immediate, intense pressure to start a family. You've survived the social scrutiny, the physical awkwardness, and the weight of dynastic expectation. But let's be honest, even that immense pressure takes a back seat to the relentless, inescapable reality that will define the vast majority of your married life. Work. Forget exotic honeymoons or lazy mornings recuperating from wedding festivities. The sun rises early in the medieval world, and whether you're a peasant couple tied to the land or a craftsperson's family in a bustling, by medieval standards, town, your days are immediately swallowed by labor. Your life isn't segmented into work hours and leisure time. It's a continuous cycle dictated by daylight, seasons, and the pressing needs of survival. This is the daily grind, the mundane reality that underpins everything else. You are married now, and that means you are a working unit, more vital and productive together than you were apart. For most of you, this means farming. The vast majority of medieval people lived and worked on the land. If you're a newly married peasant couple, your days are fundamentally ruled by the rhythms of agriculture. Even if your family has a specific craft or trade, you likely still have a garden plot, maybe some animals, and the necessity of supplementing your income or food supply through manual labor. Life is physically demanding, often backbreaking, and rarely offers a moment of true idleness until the short days of deep winter. And even then, there's always something that needs doing. Let's start with the wife's daily chores, which are numerous and absolutely critical to the household's survival. Your morning might begin before dawn, stirring the fire that was carefully banked last night to keep embers alive. You'll be preparing the first meal of the day, likely pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, if you have them, and maybe a bit of dried meat or fish if you're lucky. This involves grinding grain, perhaps by hand with a quern, two heavy stones you turn, chopping vegetables with a knife that's probably not very sharp, and stirring over an open fire, constantly vigilant against spills or burns. Next comes tending to any animals you might have. Chickens need feeding and eggs collected. If you have a cow or a goat, they need milking, a cold, damp task in the early morning air. You'll need to fetch water from the well or stream, which could be a significant distance away, carrying heavy buckets back to the house. This isn't a quick trip, it's a daily trek, often multiple times a day, the water sloshing, the yoke digging into your shoulders. Throughout the day, there's a constant cycle of food preparation. Most food needs extensive processing to be edible and safe. Grain must be ground, legumes soaked, meat preserved, salting, smoking, drying, no refrigeration. Bread needs baking, which is a major undertaking, often done weekly or bi-weekly in a communal oven. Imagine the sheer effort of kneading dough for a week's worth of bread, hauling it to the oven, and managing the firing. Cooking is a constant task, feeding hungry bodies that are burning through calories with hard labor. Then there are the household chores themselves. Medieval homes, while perhaps cozy with a fire, were far from easy to keep clean. Earthen floors were common. They needed sweeping, perhaps occasionally scattering fresh rushes. Smoke from the fire filled the air, coating everything in soot. Bedding needed airing and cleaning, which often involved beating out straw mattresses. Laundry was a monumental task, done by hand in cold water using lye soap, often homemade, requiring vigorous scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing, usually down by the river or a wash trough. Quirky tidbit. Speaking of laundry, medieval people didn't wash their clothes with the frequency we do today. Outer garments were brushed and aired, while linen undergarments were changed more often and were the primary focus of washing. The sheer labor involved meant a wash day was a major event, maybe happening only a few times a year for heavier items. So yes, things probably smelled a bit lived in. Don't expect that freshly laundered scent, and that's just the basics inside the home. The wife was also often responsible for the garden plot, growing vegetables and herbs essential for meals and simple medicines. She might tend beehives for honey, a precious sweetener and source of wax, or manage the poultry flock. She'd also be heavily involved in processing whatever the farm produced, spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving cloth, sewing and mending clothes for the family. This textile work was incredibly time-consuming. A simple shirt or tunic represented hours upon hours of labor, from cleaning the fiber to spinning the yarn to weaving the fabric to cutting and sewing. Meanwhile, the husband's work is largely focused on the agricultural fields. This is where the bulk of the calories are produced. Plowing the fields, often with oxen or horses, if you're lucky enough to own them, otherwise it's heavy digging by hand or with a simple wooden plowshare, is strenuous. Planting seeds at the right time requires skill and knowledge passed down through generations. Weeding is a constant battle against nature, stooping or kneeling for hours under the sun or in the rain. The harvest is the absolute peak of the year's labor. This is a frantic period where everyone, including children and the elderly, pitches in. Grain must be cut, gathered into sheaves, and threshed to separate the edible kernels from the stalks. This involves beating the grain with flails for days on end, monotonous, dusty, and physically exhausting work. Then the grain needs winnowing to remove the chaff, usually by tossing it in the air so the wind blows the lighter bits away. This is followed by storage, constantly guarding against pests and damp. Beyond the crops, there's animal care. Larger livestock like cattle, sheep, or pigs require pasturing, feeding, mucking out stables, and protecting them from predators. If you raise animals for meat, there's the bloody, difficult work of slaughtering and butchering. Tools and equipment constantly need maintenance and repair. Wooden plows break, carts need wheels fixed, fences fall down, buildings need patching, roofs leak. There's always something to mend, build, or fix. Why did the medieval farmer always carry a ladder? Because he heard the work was sometimes on the level. Get it? Field puns. Peak medieval comedy. This isn't a job you leave at the end of the day. Your home is often your workplace, and your family members are your colleagues. The labor is integrated into the fabric of your existence. There's no distinction between work life and home life because they are one and the same. You wake up and you work. You eat brief meals and you work. You might pause for prayer and you work. You go to sleep exhausted only to wake up and do it all again. Think about the sheer physical toll. Your hands are rough, calloused, likely cracked and dirty. Your back aches constantly. Your muscles are strong but perpetually tired. Injuries are common. Cuts from tools, sprains from lifting, bruises from falls. There's no health and safety manual, no ergonomic assessment of your tasks. You work until the job is done or the light fails. Modern aside, imagine trying to live this life with your modern sensibilities. No hot water on demand, no washing machine, no dishwasher, no refrigerator, no gas stove, no car to get to the well, no vacuum cleaner, no power tools, no ready-made clothes, no pre-packaged food, no doctor to call for a sprain, no pain reliever stronger than maybe willow bark tea. It puts that pile of laundry you've been ignoring into perspective, doesn't it? Your entire existence revolves around manual labor just to stay fed, clothed, and sheltered. The division of labor, while generally following gender lines, men the fields, women the hearth and garden, wasn't rigidly defined. During peak times like harvest, everyone worked in the fields. Women often helped with lighter field tasks like weeding or gleaning, collecting leftover stalks after the main harvest. Men might help with fetching water or assisting with animal tasks. Marriage meant you now had a partner to share this workload, doubling the household's productive capacity, which was essential for survival. You weren't just merging lives, you were merging labor forces. Mainstream fact. An estimated 85–90% of the medieval population in Western Europe were peasants directly involved in agriculture. Their lives, and thus the lives of most newly married couples, were overwhelmingly dominated by the demands of farming and the provision of basic necessities through manual labor. The image of knights and castles is glamorous, but the reality for the vast majority was muddy fields and calloused hands. This shared labor, however grueling, was also the foundation of your partnership. You relied on each other completely. If one of you was sick or injured, the other had to somehow pick up the slack, often an impossible task. Your mutual effort directly translated into food on the table, warmth in the house, and clothes on your backs. There's a certain practical intimacy that comes from depending on someone for your basic survival every single day. Let's try another joke. Why did the medieval chicken cross the road? To get away from the farmer's wife who needed potage ingredients. Okay, that one was foul. While the outline specified peasant life, even in towns, the labor was intense. A merchant's wife might manage the shop accounts and sales while he traveled. A craftsperson's wife would likely be deeply involved in the family business, spinning yarn for a weaver, preparing hides for a tanner, selling wares in the market. Domestic servants in a wealthy household had their own intense, nonstop schedule of cleaning, cooking, and attending to their masters. Labor was universal. Historians still argue about the degree of independence or interdependence between spouses within these working units. Were medieval marriages primarily economic partnerships driven by the need for labor, with affection being secondary? Or did the shared struggle and mutual reliance foster deep bonds of companionship and love that transcended the purely practical? It's difficult to know definitively, as personal feelings are rarely documented, but the economic necessity of marriage is undeniable. The sheer continuity of work meant there was little time for leisure as we understand it. Even Sundays and feast days, while free from servile labor, the heaviest, most physically demanding work, still involved chores like animal care and food preparation. Any spare moments might be spent on repairs, visiting neighbors, who were also likely working, or simple forms of entertainment like storytelling or games often shared communally rather than privately as a couple. Imagine the conversations you'd have after a long day. Probably not about your feelings or your dreams for the future, but about the state of the crop, the cow's health, the hole in the roof, the price of grain at the market, or the never-ending pile of spinning. Your shared reality was defined by the demands of survival and the physical effort required to meet them. Let's squeeze in one more joke. What do you call a lazy medieval farmer? A crop dud. I'll stop now, promise. Even intimacy was likely affected by this constant exhaustion. After a day spent working from dawn till dusk, muscles aching and body weary, the energy levels for anything beyond falling into bed would be low. Procreation, as discussed previously, was a duty, and perhaps the primary focus of marital sex, fitting into the overall framework of productive labor for the household. So, as you settle into married life in the Middle Ages, the initial excitements and anxieties quickly give way to the persistent reality of daily labor. You are a unit, bound together by the need to work the land, tend the animals, manage the household, and produce the necessities of life through sheer physical effort. It's a life defined by routine, necessity, and the constant cycle of nature. It's hard, it's tiring, and it leaves very little time for anything other than the fundamental tasks required to simply survive until tomorrow. Welcome to the daily grind of medieval marriage. So you're deep in the daily rhythm now, the relentless cycle of physical labor that forms the bedrock of your medieval life together. The sun is your clock, the seasons your calendar, and exhaustion your constant companion. But all that effort, all that sweat and toil is directed towards one fundamental goal: survival. And survival isn't just about having enough food or shelter. It's also about navigating the treacherous, invisible landscape of health. Because in the medieval world, sickness isn't an inconvenience. It's a disaster always lurking just around the corner, and staying even remotely clean feels like an uphill battle fought with limited tools. Let's talk about personal hygiene first. Forget daily showers, running water on demand, or even the concept of cleanliness as we know it. Washing wasn't the automatic, refreshing routine you're used to. It was a deliberate act, often requiring significant effort. You'd get water from the same well or stream you drank from, heat it painstakingly over the fire, which takes a surprising amount of fuel and time, and then wash, probably in a simple basin or tub, often sharing the water with other family members. Full immersion baths were a luxury, perhaps taken occasionally at a public bathhouse, if your town had one and you could afford it, or maybe a rare treat using a large wooden tub at home. Quirky tidbit: public bathhouses did exist in medieval towns and cities, and they weren't just for washing. They could be social hubs, places to relax, chat, and even get a shave or a haircut. Some even served food and drink. However, their popularity waxed and waned over the centuries, sometimes viewed with suspicion due to potential associations with immorality or, ironically, the spread of disease during outbreaks. So taking a dip wasn't always a straightforward, squeaky clean affair. More common than a full bath was washing hands and face daily, and perhaps washing your linen undergarments reasonably regularly. These were the things that touched your skin directly. Outer clothes made of wool or other heavier fabrics were brushed and aired to remove dirt and smells, but rarely washed because the process was so harsh on the fabric and took so long to dry. So that wool tunic you wear? Expect it to carry the sense of smoke, sweat, animals, and whatever you've been working with. Layering was key, with washable linen acting as a barrier between your skin and the smellier outer layers. Soap existed, usually made from animal fat and lye, derived from wood ash, but it wasn't the commercially produced, pleasant-smelling stuff you grab off a supermarket shelf. It was a harsher, often homemade substance, effective for cutting grease and dirt, but probably not doing wonders for your skin's moisture. Washing your hair was also a less frequent event, perhaps weekly or even less often, again involving heating water and using that basic lye soap or herbal rinses. Lice were a common issue, accepted as an unpleasant fact of life rather than a sign of neglect. Dental hygiene was rudimentary at best. People might chew on abrasive twigs, use rough cloths, or rinse their mouths with water or herbal solutions. Sugar was incredibly rare and expensive, so cavities weren't as prevalent from that source. But tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss were still common due to diet and lack of effective cleaning. You'd likely have lost a tooth or two, maybe more, by middle age. Sanitation was another huge challenge. In rural areas, people used simple pit latrines or just found a convenient spot away from the house and water source. Not ideal for public health. In towns, it was often worse. Waste was sometimes collected in cesspits, but just as often it was thrown into the street or nearby waterways. Imagine walking down a narrow, crowded street in a medieval town, dodging not just people and animals, but also the contents of chamber pots being emptied from upper windows. Pungent, to say the least. Water sources, whether wells or rivers, were constantly at risk of contamination from human and animal waste, industrial activities like tanning hides or dyeing cloth, and general runoff. Drinking water was often unsafe, which is one reason why people drank so much ale or weak wine. The fermentation process killed some of the harmful bacteria. Why did the medieval couple argue about washing the dishes? Because they kept dissing the water supply. Okay, maybe that one was a bit strained, like medieval dishwater. This constant proximity to dirt, waste, and contaminated water meant that disease was rampant. Your married life together isn't just about working, it's also about constantly trying to ward off or survive illness. Simple cuts could turn into deadly infections. A common cold could escalate into a fatal respiratory illness. Diarrhea from contaminated food or water could quickly lead to dehydration and death, especially for children. Then there were the larger threats, the sudden, terrifying arrival of epidemics. Plagues like the Black Death could sweep through a community, killing a huge percentage of the population in weeks. Even lesser-known fevers or outbreaks of dysentery could decimate families. When illness struck your household, it wasn't just a medical crisis, it was an economic one. If you or your spouse became too ill to work, the household's ability to produce food, earn income, and simply survive ground to a halt. There was no sick pay, no social safety net beyond what your immediate family or neighbors might offer, and they were likely struggling themselves. Caring for a sick spouse or child was a physically and emotionally draining task, often done with little knowledge of the actual cause of the illness. You'd rely on folk remedies, prayers, and maybe the advice of a local healer. What kind of doctor did medieval peasants see? A quacktor. All right, that one was foul again. Wait, already used a chicken joke. Scratch that. How about, why did the medieval doctor carry a bag of straw? In case he needed to stuff a patient's wound. Yeah, that's not much better. Moving on. Medical understanding was a complex mix of ancient Greek and Roman theories, Christian beliefs, folk wisdom, and superstition. The dominant theory was humorism, which held that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these humors, caused by diet, lifestyle, environmental factors, or even astrological influences. Treatments aimed to restore balance, often through practices like bloodletting, cutting a vein to drain blood, or purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, methods that often weakened rather than helped the patient. Mainstream fact: bloodletting was an incredibly common medical practice throughout the Middle Ages and for centuries beyond. It was used to treat a vast range of ailments, from fevers to headaches to infections, based on the belief that removing excess blood would restore the balance of humors. It was often performed by barbers who had sharp blades and experience with bleeding from shaving. Finding medical help depended heavily on where you lived and how much money you had. In the countryside, you might rely on a local wise woman or cunning man who had knowledge of herbal remedies and perhaps some traditional healing practices. Monasteries sometimes had infirmaries that treated the sick, and monks might have access to medical texts and knowledge, though this varied greatly. In towns, you might find apothecaries who sold herbal mixtures and remedies, or barber surgeons who could perform minor surgical procedures, set broken bones, and of course, perform bloodletting. Trained physicians who had studied at universities existed but were rare, expensive, and primarily served the wealthy elite. Their training, based on ancient texts, often included anatomy, sometimes learned from dissecting animal carcasses, or rarely human ones, and pharmacology, but they still largely adhered to humorism. So, if your spouse fell ill, your primary role would be caregiver. You'd administer whatever remedies were available: herbal teas, poultices, pastes applied to the skin, perhaps trying to keep them warm or cool depending on the perceived imbalance. You'd pray for their recovery and perhaps seek help if you could afford or access it. It was a frightening, uncertain time with little in the way of effective treatment for serious conditions. Many illnesses simply ran their course, and recovery or death was often left to chance or perceived divine will. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of practices like bloodletting and purging did more harm than good on the whole, or if the observed recoveries were simply the body healing itself despite the intervention, or if there were specific, unrecorded instances where these methods did happen to coincide with or aid recovery in some way. It's hard to measure effectiveness when the underlying diagnostic framework was so fundamentally different from modern medicine. The intimacy of marriage also meant sharing close quarters with sickness. If one of you caught a contagious illness, the other was highly likely to get it too. There was no concept of isolation rooms or even basic understanding of how germs spread through coughs or touch. You shared a bed, shared eating utensils, if you had any beyond a knife and spoon. Often you ate communally from trenchers or shared pots, and lived in a small, often poorly ventilated space. Caring for a sick spouse meant close physical contact, increasing your own risk exponentially. Modern aside, try to imagine living with the constant low-grade hum of anxiety about illness. That little cough your spouse has, is it just a cold or the start of something much worse? That stomach ache? Did they eat something bad, or is dysentery coming? Every ache, every fever, every unusual symptom carries a weight of potential disaster because effective treatments are scarce and costly, and death is a much closer neighbor than it is for most of us today. You didn't have antibiotics, vaccines, or even reliable pain relief beyond things like opium, if you could get it and knew how to use it safely, which wasn't guaranteed, or alcohol. The physical toll of daily work was exacerbated by this precarious state of health. Constant exposure to the elements, poor diet, often lacking in essential nutrients, especially vitamins in winter, strenuous labor leading to injuries, and chronic infections weakened the body's ability to fight off disease. It was a vicious cycle. Work made you vulnerable. Illness prevented you from working, which threatened your survival. Even small injuries could be debilitating. A sprained ankle or a deep cut on your hand wasn't just painful. It meant you couldn't perform crucial tasks like plowing or spinning, directly impacting the household's output. Healing was slow, infections were common, and a simple broken bone could easily become infected or set improperly, leading to permanent disability. Imagine trying to do medieval farming or household chores with a permanently crooked or painful limb. There's a certain grim resilience required just to be medieval, isn't there? You learn to live with discomfort, with aches and pains, with the constant possibility of things going wrong with your body or the bodies of those you love. Your partner isn't just your co-worker in the fields or home. They're also your fellow traveler in this risky health landscape, the one you care for and who cares for you when illness strikes, using whatever limited means you have. How did medieval doctors advertise? They put up signs of their practice. Okay, stretching for these jokes now. Must be the sleepy cadence setting in. Pregnancy and childbirth, which we'll talk more about soon, were incredibly dangerous times for women, representing a significant health risk that medieval couples faced. Infant and child mortality rates were appallingly high. It was common for a couple to lose several children before one or two survived to adulthood. This wasn't just an emotional tragedy, it was a constant health crisis within the family unit, requiring intensive, often futile, caregiving. The shared vulnerability to illness and injury inevitably shaped your relationship. You relied on your spouse not just for labor, but for care, comfort, and support during times of sickness. When one of you was down, the other had to step up and somehow manage everything, adding immense stress to an already difficult situation. Recovering from a serious illness might take months, during which time the household's resources would be severely strained. So as you live your married life in the medieval world, the idealized notions of romance or even the practicalities of work are constantly overshadowed by the stark realities of health and hygiene. Your bodies are constantly under threat from 1,000 invisible enemies, and your ability to fight them off is limited by knowledge, resources, and the primitive state of medicine and sanitation. Staying alive and reasonably healthy is a full-time job in itself, a challenge you face together armed with little more than prayer, a few herbs, and immense, often desperate, hope. Welcome to the fragrant, precarious reality of medieval health. Okay, the noise is starting to change. It's not that everyone suddenly developed social graces or remembered they had their own beds to get to. It's more that the specific ritual of the bedding ceremony is concluding. You're on the bed, you've potentially been showered with grain and footwear, maybe a quick blessing has been given, and the most important part, the witnessing that you are, in fact, together in the designated place, has been achieved. The immediate physical shoving you onto the mattress stage is over. Now, the process of leaving begins, though it might not be a swift or silent exit. The crowd starts to thin, but it's less like people politely filing out and more like a slow, reluctant dispersal. Think of it like trying to clear a bar at closing time. There are stragglers, people lingering by the door, others still finishing their drinks, or in this case, maybe their bawdy songs. Some trying to get one last look, one last joke in. Your closest attendants, the ones who helped get you dressed and escorted you here, might still be in the room, maybe tidying up, maybe helping you with the next steps, which likely involves shedding those elaborate, uncomfortable wedding clothes. You feel a tiny bit of the intense pressure lift as the bulk of the onlookers finally make their way out. The air in the room, which was thick with the scent of too many bodies, torch smoke, and general revelry, starts to feel marginally less oppressive. The noise level drops from a roar to a loud murmur from outside the door or in the adjacent hall. It's not quiet by any stretch, but it's no longer a full-blown circus tent surrounding your bed. You can finally hear yourself think, which, given the circumstances, might not be an entirely welcome development. Your attendants, likely the bridesmaids and groomsmen, are still there. For the bride, this is where the delicate, often multi-layered wedding dress is carefully, or perhaps not so carefully, removed. These weren't simple zip-up affairs. We're talking layers of fabric, potentially elaborate lacings, pins, girdles, and possibly even uncomfortable undergarments designed to achieve a specific silhouette. Imagine trying to get out of a medieval wedding dress after a long, exhausting day of ceremony, feasting, and being paraded around, with a couple of slightly tipsy friends helping, all while your new spouse is sitting awkwardly on the bed nearby, trying to pretend they're not watching. Fun times. The groom's disrobing was probably less complicated, but still involved removing layers of medieval attire, which wasn't exactly built for speed or comfort. Swords or daggers, belts, tunics, maybe even elaborate hose. It all had to come off. His attendants might assist him, perhaps with more joshing and crude comments than the women. The atmosphere among the attendants was likely lighter now, their main duty of delivering you to the bed complete, leaving only the secondary duty of ensuring you were prepared. This act of the attendants helping the couple undress wasn't just practical, it was another part of the ritual. It symbolized the shedding of their previous single identities and preparing them for their new shared state. It also ensured that any knots or ties that might have been magically placed to prevent consummation, yes, that was a real fear, could be checked and undone. Because, you wouldn't want a pesky magic knot ruining the potentially already awkward first night. Quirky tidbit. There was a widespread belief in medieval Europe that certain spells or charms, sometimes called ligatures, could be cast to prevent a couple from consummating their marriage. Guests or attendants might carefully examine the couple's clothing during the undressing process for any hidden knots or objects thought to be tied by someone wishing them ill. So while you're being unlaced or unbuckled, your attendants are performing a final protective sweep, ensuring no ill-wishing neighbor or jolted ex has managed to curse your night. It adds another layer of bizarreness to the already surreal situation. You're not just getting ready for bed, you're also undergoing a medieval anti-hex check. The attendants might not leave immediately after you're undressed. Sometimes they would linger, perhaps arranging the covers, fetching a final drink, or simply chatting among themselves. The level of privacy granted to the couple varied hugely depending on social class, regional custom, and even the specific people involved. For peasants, where space was limited and families often slept communally, There might be virtually no privacy at all. The couple might share a room or even a bed with family members. For the wealthy, there might be a separate chamber, but still with attendants nearby, or even sleeping in the same room on pallets or in adjoining closets. Guardrobes. Historians still argue about the degree to which attendants or witnesses remained in the room during the actual attempt at consummation. Some accounts suggest attendants would leave shortly after the couple was in bed, maybe waiting just outside the door. Others imply they might remain in the room, perhaps turning their backs or pretending to sleep, acting as passive witnesses. The idea wasn't necessarily to watch the act itself, but to be present in the chamber to attest that the couple had the opportunity and were intending to fulfill the marital debt. It's the medieval version of having a chaperone, but way more intense and awkward. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether it was common practice for wedding attendants or family members to remain physically present within the bedchamber, perhaps feigning sleep while the newly married couple attempted consummation, or if they typically withdrew from the room, leaving the couple with a degree of privacy for the act itself. Imagine this scenario. You're finally out of your scratchy wedding finery, dressed in a simple shift or nightshirt that might still feel unfamiliar and rough. You're lying on a lumpy mattress next to a near stranger. The main crowd is gone, but your attendants are still there, maybe sitting by the fire if there is one, or just positioned awkwardly in the room. You can hear their quiet chatter, or perhaps the crackling fire, or the sounds drifting in from the rest of the ongoing festivities. The pressure is still immense, but it's shifted from being a public spectacle to a more intimate, yet still observed, expectation. There's probably an exchange of nervous glances with your new spouse. What do you even say? Well, that was quite a party. So now what? The attendants are there, a physical reminder that this isn't a private moment, at least not entirely. Their presence serves as a safeguard, a confirmation for the families involved that the marriage is indeed moving towards its legal and biological fulfillment. It's a far cry from the modern ideal of a romantic private wedding night. It's functional, witnessed, and fraught with expectations. Mainstream fact: the presence of witnesses or attendants within or immediately adjacent to the bedchamber on the wedding night was a common practice across many social strata in medieval Europe, serving to provide testimony for the consummation of the marriage, which was legally and socially crucial for its validity and the legitimacy of future heirs. You might try to make small talk, or perhaps the awkward silence is too deafening. Your attendants might offer some final pieces of advice, maybe some crude jokes directed at the groom, or less commonly, the bride, or simply offer a final blessing. The air is thick with unspoken expectations. You are no longer just two individuals. You are a couple. And your first duty as a couple, in the eyes of society and the church, is to attempt to procreate, or at least perform the act that could lead to it. The attendant's departure, when it finally happens, might be marked by a final blessing, maybe some last words of encouragement or crude humor. They leave you finally mostly alone, mostly because even if they step outside the room, they might be right there within earshot. The concept of absolute privacy as we understand it was much rarer in the medieval world, particularly in significant moments like this. You are left in the dim light, perhaps by a flickering candle or dying firelight, with your new spouse. The noise from the rest of the house or the celebration might still be audible, a constant reminder of the world outside your immediate, charged space. The bed feels different now. It's not just a place to sleep. It's the seat of immense pressure and expectation. You lie there, perhaps under heavy, scratchy wool blankets, feeling the lumpy straw or feather mattress beneath you. The silence after the crowd leaves might feel deafening, broken only by your own heart pounding or the sounds of your spouse shifting beside you. This is it, the moment everyone has been waiting for, legally required, socially expected, and potentially terrifying. You might look at your spouse, really look at them for perhaps the first time without the blinding spectacle of the wedding around you. Who is this person? What are they thinking? Are they as nervous as you are? The attendants are gone, or perhaps just out of sight, but their presence and the weight of the entire community's expectations still feels heavy in the room. This is the transition from the public ceremony to the private act. But that transition was gradual, witnessed, and often far from romantic. It's a stark reminder that medieval marriage was less about individual romance and more about familial, social, and economic contracts, sealed and validated in the most public of private moments. You're left alone finally, but the world is still watching, waiting, and you know exactly what they're waiting for. Okay, the noise has faded significantly now. It's not total silence, of course. Medieval houses weren't exactly hermetically sealed soundproof boxes. You can probably still hear muffled laughter, perhaps the distant scrape of a fiddle, or just the general hum of a household settling down or continuing to party elsewhere. But the immediate, overwhelming presence of the crowd surrounding your bed has dispersed. It's just you and your new spouse, in the dim, flickering light of a candle or the low glow of the fire. The air feels different, thinner perhaps, or just charged with a different kind of tension. This is the moment everyone has been anticipating, celebrating, and perhaps gossiping out all day. The moment that, in the eyes of the church and the state, helps solidify this union. It's time for, well, the marital duty, the consummation. And let me tell you, if you were expecting a fade to black, violin-swelling romantic scene straight out of a modern movie, you are sorely mistaken. This is medieval reality, and it's likely to be awkward, pressured, and potentially quite uncomfortable. You're lying there under scratchy wool blankets, on a mattress that might be stuffed with straw, rags, or maybe feathers if you're wealthier, but probably still feels lumpy and unfamiliar. Your body is likely tired from the long day of ceremony, feasting, and being constantly on display. You might still feel the slight itch of your underclothes, or perhaps the lingering scent of sweat and stale ale from the crowded room. Your new spouse is lying beside you, maybe just inches away, also likely feeling tired, nervous, and acutely aware of the expectations hanging in the air like the smoke from the dying fire. There's probably a period of silence. What do you even say? So, nice bedding ceremony? Awkward. Mate, the weight of the situation presses down. This isn't just about personal connection. It's a legal and social obligation. Consummation was, in many legal and theological frameworks of the time, crucial for the full validity of a marriage. It wasn't just the formal vows that sealed the deal, it was the physical union. No pressure, right? Just the entire legitimacy of your new life, maybe the inheritance of property, and the potential legitimacy of your future children, all riding on what happens next. Talk about performance anxiety. Mainstream fact. In medieval canon law and many secular legal systems, the consummation of a marriage through sexual intercourse was often considered a necessary component for its complete and indissoluble validity, particularly in cases where the vows were later challenged or disputed. So you're lying there, aware that this act isn't merely an expression of intimacy, which likely didn't exist yet given the commonality of arranged marriages, or even pleasure, but a fundamental duty. It's a transaction, a legal ratification. It's about producing heirs and securing the family lines. Romance, if it ever came, was something that might develop later, a happy bonus rather than the foundation of the union. And privacy? Well, as we discussed, that concept was often very different. Even if the attendants left the immediate room, they might be just outside the door or sleeping on pallets in the same chamber. The idea of absolute solitude for this moment was rare. You might still hear their movements, their quiet conversations, or even their heavy breathing if they've fallen asleep nearby. It's like trying to have an intimate moment with your parents sleeping in the next room, but with medieval levels of awkwardness and societal pressure layered on top. Good luck getting in the mood. Maybe light a candle and put on some Gregorian chant? Probably not going to help. The expectations were immense, especially for the groom. He was expected to, well, perform. There wasn't a lot of cultural understanding of sexual dysfunction from a purely medical perspective. Difficulties in consummation were often attributed to witchcraft. Remember those ligatures we mentioned? Divine displeasure or just personal failing. For the bride, the expectation was perhaps more passive, to be compliant and hopefully conceive quickly. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the level of sexual knowledge or education medieval couples, particularly those from non-aristocratic backgrounds, received before their wedding night, and how this might have impacted their experience of consummation. Did anyone explain things? Did parents or attendants offer advice? Perhaps, but it might have been crude, superstitious, or simply non-existent. So you're potentially navigating this incredibly high-stakes, physically awkward, potentially observed situation with little to no prior knowledge or experience. What could possibly go wrong? The physical reality of the time didn't exactly lend itself to comfort either. Hygiene standards were, shall we say, different. Baths were less frequent for most people than they are today. The air in the room might be stale. The bed itself could be itchy. And then there's the potential for pain, particularly for the bride, encountering sexual activity for the first time without any concept of foreplay or comfort being prioritized over the functional goal. It wasn't exactly a recipe for a relaxing or pleasurable experience for either party. Imagine the silent stretching, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire or the sounds from outside. You look at your spouse. They look back. Maybe a nervous smile. Maybe a complete lack of expression. Just as terrified as you are. The pressure builds. You know what needs to happen. Society knows what needs to happen. Even your potentially still listening attendants know what needs to happen. It's less about desire and more about duty, like paying your taxes, but naked and under blankets. Quirky tidbit. There are scattered historical accounts in legal texts from the medieval period that discuss cases where marriages were annulled due to non-consummation, sometimes involving physical examinations of the couple to determine if intercourse was possible or had occurred. This highlights how seriously the legal system took this aspect of marriage. So the pressure isn't just social. It could become a matter for courts and potentially lead to the dissolution of the marriage if the act wasn't completed. No pressure, seriously. It makes swiping right on a dating app feel like the most relaxed decision you'll ever make. Perhaps one of you tentatively reaches out, or maybe it's a direct, slightly clumsy move born of pure obligation. There's no gentle seduction, no whispered sweet nothings, unless they were part of a ritualistic blessing, which is possible but probably not what you're picturing. It's functional, it's a task, and it's potentially happening while you can hear your mother-in-law snoring faintly from the next room. Riveting. The expectation of consummation often meant the act was attempted on the wedding night itself or very soon after. Delaying could raise suspicions. It wasn't something you could just put off until you felt more comfortable or got to know each other better. The clock was ticking, metaphorically and sometimes literally, with observers waiting for confirmation. Think about the mental state. You've been dressed up, paraded around, feasted, drunk, sung at, shoved onto a bed, and now you're expected to perform this intimate act with someone you might have barely spoken to alone before today. There's likely anxiety, maybe fear, certainly awkwardness. Where does romance fit into that equation? It doesn't, not really. The goal was practical: secure the marriage, start the process of creating legitimate heirs. Any personal connection or affection was secondary to these overriding social and economic imperatives. The wedding night was the functional, biological, legal fulfillment of the contracts signed and witnessed that day. You might try to speak to break the tension, but what is there to say? The unspoken expectation fills the space between you. The dim light casts shadows, hiding details, but highlighting the strangeness of the situation. You can feel the heat radiating from your spouse's body next to yours under the heavy covers. Every rustle of the straw mattress, every creak of the bed frame feels amplified in the quiet. And then, perhaps it happens. The attempt is made. It might be quick, fumbling, and focused purely on the objective. It might be painful. It might be unsuccessful due to nerves, inexperience, or just the general unromantic chaos of the situation. But the attempt itself was often the critical part, proving that the couple was capable and willing to fulfill their marital duty. This wasn't about shared pleasure or mutual desire. It was about procreation and legitimacy. It was a stark, unadorned reminder of the primary purpose of marriage in medieval society. And you are right there experiencing it firsthand. The anti-hex check was just the warm-up act for this main event of functional pressured intimacy. It's a far cry from modern wedding night fantasies, substituting romance and privacy with duty and awkward observation. You're definitely not surviving this awkwardness without wanting to pull the scratchy wool blanket over your head and disappear. But alas, duty calls. So there you are, lying in the dim light, the silence heavy with expectation, or maybe just exhaustion. The attempt at consummation might have happened quickly, perhaps fumbling, perhaps painful, definitely not the stuff of troubadour songs. It was a duty, a necessary act to validate the union, to secure the family line, to fulfill the requirements of law and custom. Forget romance. Think of it more like signing a very awkward physical contract. It might have been successful right away, or perhaps nerves, inexperience, or sheer awkwardness meant it wasn't. Historians note that non-consummation did happen, sometimes leading to annulment proceedings that could be quite public and humiliating. But let's assume, for the sake of moving on to breakfast, that the act was at least attempted and deemed sufficient by whoever needed convincing. You definitely didn't get a performance review afterward, thankfully. The moment passes. The pressure perhaps eases slightly, replaced by a different kind of quiet. The quiet that follows fulfilling an obligation, even if it was uncomfortable. You might turn away from your new spouse, or maybe you fall into an exhausted sleep. The day's rituals, the food, the drink, the sheer sensory overload finally catching up with you. Sleep on a straw mattress, even under heavy wool blankets, might not be the most comfortable you've ever experienced. But after that day, you'd probably sleep on a bed of rocks. Then comes the morning. And if you thought the wedding night was about privacy, prepare for disappointment. Privacy was not a high priority amenity in medieval life, especially for important people. And a wedding, even for those lower down the social scale, was a deeply public affair from start to finish. You don't get to wake up leisurely, alone with your thoughts and your new partner. Oh no, the party isn't quite over yet, it just moved to the bedroom. The morning after was often another ritualistic event. People, potentially the same attendants who helped you get into bed, or close family members, would likely return to the bedchamber relatively early. Why? To welcome the new couple into their first day of married life, of course. And maybe, just maybe, to check that everything had proceeded as planned. One common custom involved bringing the couple breakfast in bed. Now, this wasn't about pampering them after a long night. It was part of the ceremony. The specific meal might vary, but a popular choice was a caudle. Remember that warm, spiced gruel or thin porridge-like drink? Yeah, that. Often made with ale or wine, eggs, bread, and spices. It was considered nourishing and fortifying, presumably necessary after the rigors of the night, or just the general exhaustion of the wedding. So you're waking up, possibly groggy, possibly sore, likely still feeling awkward, and someone is handing you a steaming bowl of alcoholic porridge while standing at the foot of your bed. Talk about an intimate morning meal. It's like having your first breakfast as a married couple be a mandatory performance art piece. Here, have some caudle. Congratulations on everything. Mainstream. Fact, serving a special precursor often meant a caudle to the newly married couple in their bedchamber on the morning after the wedding was a widespread custom in many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, symbolizing sustenance and fertility. But the caudle wasn't just breakfast. It was also part of the public acknowledgement of the transition. It was presented by family or close friends, reinforcing the community's role in supporting the marriage. And yes, it also served as a convenient excuse for people to be in the bedchamber relatively early. Now let's address something that sounds incredibly invasive to modern ears, but which crops up in historical accounts and legal records: the potential for examining the bedding. Yes, you heard that right. In some cultures, at some times there was a practice, sometimes formal, sometimes informal gossip, that involved checking the sheets for proof of consummation, specifically bloodstains from the rupture of the hymen. This was particularly prevalent in cultures that placed a high premium on female virginity at marriage. Quirky tidbit. While documentation is scattered and interpretation debated, Some historical accounts and legal texts suggest that in certain regions or circumstances, the bloody sheets from the wedding night might even be publicly displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. Let that sink in. Not only did you have to perform your marital duty under pressure, potentially with people nearby, but the result of that act might be subject to inspection. It's the ultimate lack of privacy. Imagine the pressure that put on both the bride and groom. For the bride, the fear of pain, the invasion of privacy, and the potential shame if there wasn't proof, regardless of the reason. For the groom, the pressure to both succeed in consummation and potentially to provide the proof. It makes you appreciate modern-day do not disturb signs and just, not having your bed linen inspected by your in-laws. Historians still argue whether this sheet-checking practice was widespread and routine for everyone, or if it was more common in specific regions, for specific social classes, perhaps more for nobility where lineage proof was paramount, or primarily something that happened only when a marriage was later contested. Were the sheets just casually glanced at? Or was it a formal, announced inspection? Was it symbolic or a literal search for evidence? Scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the true prevalence and social significance of the custom of examining the wedding sheets for proof of consummation across different regions and social strata in medieval Europe, with some suggesting it was more symbolic or applied primarily in cases of legal dispute rather than being a routine part of every wedding. Regardless of how routine it was, the existence of the concept underscores how fundamentally different medieval views on marriage, sex, and privacy were. Your wedding night wasn't just between you and your spouse. It was a performance, a public transition watched and sanctioned by the community. The morning after continued this public aspect. After the caudle and any potential and deeply uncomfortable bedding checks, other visitors might arrive to offer congratulations. It was a time for well-wishing, for celebrating the successful completion of the wedding rites, and for officially acknowledging the couple as married in the eyes of the community. Presents might be given. More food and drink might appear. The party, which had perhaps quieted down for a few hours, might pick up again, now centered around the newly married couple in their bedchamber. You might have to sit up in bed, perhaps propped against pillows, if you have them. Remember, this isn't a fluffy modern hotel. Still wearing whatever you slept in, accepting greetings and congratulations. Your head might be pounding from the previous night's revelry. You might be deeply uncomfortable from the physical and emotional events of the last 12 hours. But you smile, you accept the caudle, you endure the well-wishers. You are now officially a married person, and the world wants to make sure they witnessed it all, right up to you being fed breakfast in bed, while potentially being judged on your, performance. It's a stark contrast to the modern ideal of a quiet, romantic wedding night and a leisurely, private morning after. Medieval marriage was a communal event, a social and economic contract as much as, if not more than, an emotional bond. The wedding night and the following morning were integral parts of publicizing and validating that contract. From the procession to the bedding ceremony, to the pressured consummation, and the public mourning rituals, every step reinforced the fact that this was a union not just of two people, but of two families, two lineages, affecting property, status, and the future of the community. There's a chance that after the morning greetings and rituals, the couple might be left alone for a while, perhaps to finally get dressed and rejoin the rest of the household. Or maybe they were expected to immediately start participating in the daily life of their new home, perhaps even hosting continued festivities. Medieval life didn't always allow for much downtime, even after a momentous occasion like a wedding. No week-long honeymoon to Bali for you. More like, right, you're married now? Great, the cows still need milking, and there's a pile of laundry the size of a small haystack waiting fighting for you. Think about the sheer lack of personal space and autonomy throughout this entire process. From being dressed and paraded, to being literally put into bed by guests, to having your most intimate act pressured and potentially scrutinized. Your body and your personal life were in many ways public property, or at least subject to intense public interest and control. It wasn't about your feelings or your comfort. It was about fulfilling a societal role and ensuring the continuation of the family line. The morning after wasn't just about waking up. It was about presenting the result of the wedding night to the community. It was the final crucial step in the public performance of marriage. The breakfast, the well-wishers, the presence of others, it all cemented your new status and, implicitly or explicitly, confirmed that the union had been physically ratified. It's a fascinating, if somewhat horrifying, glimpse into a world where the line between public and private was incredibly blurry, and where even the most intimate moments were subject to societal oversight. So you finish your caudle, perhaps trying not to make eye contact with anyone lingering by the bed. You navigate the awkward congratulations. You start to think about the rest of your life, now inextricably linked to this person beside you and this new household. The wedding is officially over, but the marriage and all its medieval realities, both challenging and eventually perhaps, hopefully rewarding in its own way, is just beginning. You've made it through the spectacle, the pressure, the lack of privacy, and the potentially awkward morning after. You survived the medieval wedding night, mostly. Now about that haystack of laundry, now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sounds of the medieval household are fading now. The distant echo of music, the murmuring voices, even the crackle of the fire you imagined in the bedchamber. They're all softening, becoming less distinct. You're drifting away from the scratchy wool blankets, the lumpy mattress, the awkward silence. Let the images of public weddings, demanding duties, and invasive morning rituals gently dissolve. You don't have to worry about caudal or sheet inspections tonight. You are safe, warm, and comfortable wherever you are listening. Let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders. Feel yourself sinking deeper into your bed, surrounded by peace and quiet. The history has done its work. Just breathe softly. Feel the calmness spreading through you. The sounds are gone now. Only the soft hum of the fan or the quiet stillness of your room remains. Allow yourself to completely relax. There's nothing more to think about. Just sleep. Let the peace wash over you. You are drifting into deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.